Music only lasts for so long, so might as well dance while you still can.
This happened when I was a teenager, and I was living alone for the first time. About 3 or 4 months passed and things were going well. But then, one night, things changed. I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and I heard something. The knocking sound came from the front door. I had a video doorbell with an intercom. Didn't you see that? I wondered. It didn't even register that it might be weird that someone was knocking at the door so late. I guess I was a night owl back then. Still am, to be honest. Anyway, without danger in mind, I casually bobbed over to the door and put my eye to the peephole. I looked, but there was no one out there. I didn't care. I just went back to bed. I forgot about the incident for a while because I started a new job working nights. Then, one night I just got back home from work. I took my shoes off by the front door and I heard a knock at the door. I quickly put my eye to the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door. No one there. I thought it was a little creepy at this point, but I thought it could have been because I might have been making some sort of noise when I was returning home at night, and a neighbor was knocking back in some sort of retaliation or protest. This weird knock at the door continued nightly. It made me feel pretty uncomfortable at night, so I called the building manager, and he said he would look into it. He said he thought that it could be kids playing a prank or something. He was decent about the situation and even put up posters on the building to ward off cold callers. But the knocks at the door didn't stop. I just got used to it in the end. I noted that the knocks seemed to occur at around 3:30 to 4 a.m. each night. It annoyed me that it was still an unsolved mystery though. So one night I decided to wait by the door from 3:10. I put my eye to the peephole to see if anyone would walk by. I must have been watching the intercom's live feed for about half an hour. I was so determined to find out who was doing this. I heard the knock at the door, and there was definitely no one there. The reason I couldn't see anyone on the intercom's video was because the knocking sound came from behind me this time. The balcony door. At that time, I thought it was a neighbor or some kid prank, but now it went up another level. It made my blood turn to ice. I didn't want to move. I couldn't afford to live anywhere else, so I just had to put up with it. Whenever I would wait by the front door, I would hear a knock on the balcony door. It seemed that the prank, or whatever it was, wouldn't go beyond a knock, so I didn't care so much. After a couple of years, an incident happened where a car plowed through my balcony doors. I lived on the ground floor and my apartment was in line with the car park outside. I guessed that some careless driver had forgotten to put the handbrake on or accidentally pulled forward into my apartment. I was livid, but I didn't have to deal with much of the admin, because by the time I came back, the police and the landlord had already dealt with it. They had patched it up with plywood as best they could and told me that repairs would be ongoing from the next day. After all that, I needed a drink, so as I was sat in my chair, staring at the mess of my apartment, sipping on the cold beer, I laughed out loud and asked absent-mindedly, "Is everything going to be okay?" I then heard a tap against the plywood. 2 knocks. But it wasn't the usual time for that kind of thing though. I smiled. It was the first time that I thought it could be something otherworldly making the knocking sound. Since that day, I loved hearing the knocks. It was a real sense of comfort. I don't want to go into detail, but as you might be able to guess, that when a teenager moves out, it's not usually for a good reason. I didn't have much of a support network around me, so coming home and saying stuff like, "I'm home," and hearing a knock or a tap as if in response was really heartwarming. I'm indebted to whoever chose to keep me company. We had 5 happy years together. The day before I moved out, I stood there in the empty apartment and asked aloud, "Is it okay if I leave?" I heard 2 knocks come back, only slower than usual. I'm not ashamed to say that I had tears in my eyes that day.
I was probably 12 or 13 at the time and cycled the 8 kilometers to school every single morning. Most days, I had a group of my Catholic school buddies riding along, but I preferred the solitary moments pedaling through those quiet roads the most, and it still stands as my best memories of school times. There was a tiny underpass, large enough for 1 rickshaw at a time, that brought me to school quicker across the army cantonment area in Kirki, Pune. Often, as I zipped through the underpass, an aged lady I would spot sitting in the corner just after, a single bag of belongings by her side, brewing some tea in a little utensil set atop a little wood fire. It was the 4th time of coming across the lady, watching her little bag of food, that I finally got the courage and heart to stop and talk to her. "Namaste, Aji," I said, Aji being grandmother in the Marathi language. "Do you live here, Aji? I see you sitting here every day as I pass." She looked up with myopic eyes and said, "I live all around this place, and this is where I sit to brew my tea and eat some food. This is my home now, and has been my home ever since I left home." I didn't ask her why she left, and knelt next to her, watching the frail and delicate lady, in her pink sari, struggle to open the packet of dal and rice. Without thinking, I took out my lunch from the pack on my cycle, asked her for a plate if she had one, and placed more than half of my tiffin onto it. She looked at the food in disbelief and asked what I would eat throughout the day, and I told her that I had friends who were happy to share their food if need be, gave her the 6 1-rupee coins I had, and bade goodbye as I was getting late for school. And every single day after that, I would look for her at her usual spot, and for sure, there she was, preparing her tea, and after a quick chat and my tiffin on her plate, I would speed off to school before the entry gate shut for assembly. My pocket money of coins I would hand over without fail, never once thinking I would need it to buy some candy or snacks from the school canteen, though I would often miss binging on tamarind candy packets on some days. Some days, when I had more time, I would chat with her and tell her some stories from school and my playtime, and she, in return, would hum a song or 2 as she ate the food. Soon it was school break, and I bade her goodbye for a month or 2, and gave her around 200 rupees I had received during one of the festivals from my aunt. I hoped it would suffice for some food and her stock of tea in the weeks I couldn't meet her. She assured me of having shelter and a source of food available, and though uneasy, I bid her a "see you soon." I often thought of her in holidays, but playing with friends soon distracted me. I did request a friend to cycle with me to the spot with some fruits and snacks, but she was nowhere to be seen. Soon school set in, and amidst the monsoon, I went through the usual route, but again she wasn't there, nor was seen for the next 2 weeks. I grew worried and increased my route on the way home, hoping to spot her sitting under a bus shelter or somewhere safer. I even asked about her to the cycle repair shop guy who filled air in the children's tires often and was just a kilometer ahead of Aji's spot. He hadn't spotted her all these days either. And finally, one sun-soaked morning, I found her at the same spot again, making her favorite tea. I stopped with a rush and shouted, "Haji, where have you been all this time? I got food for you daily." She smiled with her broken teeth and bade me a warm hello. "Don't worry, Beta. I've been around, but I'm going away soon. I need to go home." "Home?" I asked. "Home to family?" "Home to family, yes," she smiled. I offered her my tiffin again, and she offered her plate once more, but something in me felt different. I felt a deep sense of loss as I looked at her, maybe wondering if this was the last time I would see her. Once again I got up, kept the tiffin back in the pack, looked at her, and started cycling to school while waving her a goodbye. School went as usual, but her face kept popping up in my mind for some reason. Once it was time to leave, I stopped at the cycle shop to get my air filled and mentioned to the owner that I had finally met Aji after ages. "Anna, I met Aji today after so long. Thank goodness she's still around. I was worried she'd moved to another place far away." Anna looked at me with wide-set eyes. "Our Aji, who always sits there, you say?" "Han, yes. Who else, Anna? I met her today and she was telling me she's finally going back home, I guess to her village." "OP, I didn't want to tell you because you were so attached to her, but she died during the monsoon due to her age and the relentless cold weather we had since some time." I looked at him in shock. I couldn't believe it. I told him I'd given her food just this morning. It can't be. I got astride my cycle and rushed to the spot. There was no sign of the food I'd given her, nor any telltale signs of a little wood fire being lit that very morning. I stood there frozen, and the next moment, with an onset of fear, speed cycled all the way back home. I was still a child back then, and the fact that her spirit had bade goodbye hit me a bit differently. I avoided that path for months, but soon started cycling on that route again once mollified. But some years later, when I thought back to that day, I realized what an honor it was to receive her last goodbye. And I still recall her smile and her humming songs whenever I pass by that spot.
I have a lot of ghost stories to share, but this one is just something I still think about, a lot even as an adult. I grew up in a ranch in Mexico. My family owned fields upon fields of corn, wheat, and avocado. I used to play in the cornfield because that was behind my nana's house. It was like a maze, which I loved to run around in. Well, one evening, I trailed off too deep, and I got lost. I was 7 years old when this happened. As it got darker, I began to cry and roam aimlessly until I was grabbed by my arm. I screamed, but quickly realized that it was my Nana's neighbor, Petra, also her BFF. In Spanish, she was my Nana's comadre. A direct translation of the word is godmother. She baptized 3 of the 13 kids my Nana had. In my family, a comadre or compadre is a nickname used as a term of endearment for the godparents of the kids they baptized. Well, my Nana's comadre, Petra, found me and said, "Mija, why are you out so late? You know stuff creeps at night." I told her I was lost, and she reprimanded me gently, but then told me that I was far away from my Nana's house, and because it was cold, it would be best to go to her house. I held her hand, and she led me to her house. She asked if I was hungry, and I told her I was. She told me she had just made flour tortillas and had beans cooking, and that it should be finished soon. I was happy because my favorite dish is tortillas and beans. We got to her house, and it was nice and warm. She sat me on her table and served me a huge bowl of beans and then cut me some fresh cheese. She made me some mini burritos which I happily ate and then told me she was going to call my nana, that I was at her house. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt fine, ate, and was extremely full. Then after, my nana's comadre came back from calling my nana. She sat across from me and smiled. She was a small woman, with very pretty hazel eyes, and said, "Mija, I couldn't get a hold of my comadre or compadre. They must be looking for you, so finish up and wash up." I nodded. "Also, you need to tell my comadre that I'm very sorry to have left without saying goodbye," she said as well. "You're leaving, Nana Petra?" I asked, feeling really sad. "Yeah, but don't worry. I'll come back when the time's right." And she smiled at me. I was really sad. "When are you leaving?" "When I drop you off, I'll leave with my daughter," she told me. I was sad, but I agreed to tell my nana. Now that I'd finished eating, I washed my hands at her water pillar, and she led me back through the cornfield. She led me to the middle and kissed my hair and said, "Keep walking in a straight line. You'll hear your tata calling out for you. And remember to tell your nana what I said." I told her I would, and began to walk in a straight line like how she'd pointed, and I could hear my tata in the distance. I called back and we found one another in no time. He was upset. He thought a coyote found me and hurt me, and he reprimanded me until we got to the house where my nana was sitting on the dining room table. I ran up to her, and she asked me where I'd been. I told her that I'd been to Nana Petra's house, and she went pale. She asked me to clarify that, and I told her that Nana Petra found me, fed me, and brought me to the field when she hadn't been able to reach them on the phone. I told her that she wanted to say goodbye, but that she had to leave with her daughter. At that very moment, my nana began to cry, and I was scared because she was very distraught. My tata told me to stop lying because my nana was crying, and then I began to cry too. I swore it was all true. I told them what I saw, and what I ate in detail. My tata told me that it was impossible, because Nana Petra had died that very morning. They also mentioned that Nana Petra didn't have any daughters, only sons. My tata then called my uncle over, and they drove to Nana Petra's house, and I was never told anything after what they had found. Until I got older, my uncle told me that when they went to the house they found the door open. The stove was hot, but the water pillar was empty, and the daughter mentioned we came to find out that my Nana Petra, in her early 20s, miscarried a baby girl, and she mourned her for a very long time. My uncle was spooked out, but they always say that my Nana Petra came to say goodbye to my nana, but because I got lost, I sidetracked her. But nonetheless it was spooky that she fed me, and I physically felt my Nana Petra. So I still have a hard time grasping the fact that it had been her spirit, and not her physical self.
Okay, so this happened today, Friday, 3rd of January 2020 at 4:36 p.m. I, a female and 20, was cooking with my sister, who is female and 16. She was boiling the pasta and eggs, and I was making chef salad, meaning I was cutting the lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, and the cheeses and salami. When, because of time, I asked her to cut one of the cheeses, when it happened. I was cutting the salami while my sister was cutting the rigatto cheese, when I felt a warm hand, the palm of the hand to be exact, slowly pushing me forward towards the table. The palm was at the left side, and the place underneath your shoulder, same level with your armpit. That hand slowly removed its palm from me, and the place was numb, tingling, and warm, but my entire body was instantly frozen. My sister and I didn't see anyone or anything, but she saw me how one minute I was joking about how the roles inside our household were reversed and that the kids did most of the chores while the adults were playing on their phones or sleeping, and when I gasped and my body moved forward. Now, the first couple of seconds, my brain thought that it was our dad trying not to scare me by touching me, because behind me is the terrace doors that led to a room that was supposed to be a balcony, but my grandparents closed it and turned it into the sunroom that then leads to another set of terrace doors that leads to the master bedroom. We turned the sunroom into my dad's den, where he has his PC and his stuff for his hobby of building small army vehicles from plastic or wood when we moved in after Grandma died. But the fact that our dad could be heard snoring and I felt the hand scared me. My sister didn't freak out as much, but she got scared seeing me become white like snow from fear. When I explained to her what I felt, she told me that some days she feels the same thing, especially at night. A warm hand on her back before she falls asleep. She told me that she thought it was only her tired mind playing tricks. Then, I told her that many times I have felt shoves or someone touching while I do chores around the house. One time I was dancing, and I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see if my dad or mom or my aunt or my sister who were in the house were trying to get my attention. But I saw nothing. One time, I felt it in my hair, like a stroke after I woke up from a nightmare. And 2 days ago, I was bolted awake, entire body jerked forward, because of a nightmare that I can't recall. And I just knew that I was in danger when I felt the hand again stroking my hair. And when I turned around, I saw nothing, just the Christmas tree that I thought I had unplugged. When I looked at my phone, it was 9:45 a.m. So, I went and took my 10 a.m. pill for my Hashimoto thyroiditis, and then I fell back asleep. It's not the first time, but it was the first time it happened while I was with someone else in the room. I don't know if it's a friendly ghost of my grandparents or any other loved ones that we've lost, and we have lost many in the past 2 decades. My best friend said that it might be muscle spasms, but why do they feel like a warm hand? Also, my sister complained a couple of months ago that she feels watched in her room at night, and that is why she sleeps with the music on and covers her head. I told her that it must be Grandma, since the room that my sister is in was Grandma's favorite room. She used to pray in it and listen to church on the radio when she couldn't attend church. The house was built in 1978, and my grandparents sort of ordered it to be the way it is. And at 1983, my grandparents were the first residents. My house, along with the rest of the apartments in the building, was built in 1978 also. The area before it was built in was a river and farms according to my mom's knowledge. So, what are your thoughts? Ghost or something else?
This isn't a horrifying story, but it's a true and unforgettable, mysterious experience which happened to me about 20 years ago. It was a Saturday, and it was the middle of the night. For some reason, I really wanted to go for a drive. I'm not sure what came over me. I used to go on night drives all the time when I was younger, so I guess I must have been feeling nostalgic. It was past 2 a.m, and I was sat alone in my car. I parked in a huge empty car park, and I was drinking some juice I bought from a nearby vending machine. It was at this point another car pulled into the car park. The car park was empty, yet this car pulled right up next to mine. A woman got out and went to buy a drink from the vending machine. She stopped and looked my way. Even though it was dark, I could tell that she was pretty cute. A little younger than me too, I guessed. I thought myself pretty lucky. I called out to her straight away. "Hey, what are you up to? What have you been doing tonight?" From then on, the conversation kind of progressed to the point where I felt comfortable shooting my shot and inviting her for a ride in my car. I planned on driving her to some scenic spot and showing her the night views. I guess my motives weren't completely gentlemanly. If we clicked at that night viewing spot, then I would invite her to a hotel. I was getting carried away with my own fantasies on the drive. I barely noticed that she had begun to cry. I pulled over and asked her what was wrong. She told me that she had gone driving that night with the intention of taking her own life. She told me that there were so many reasons, but wouldn't go into great detail about them. Naturally, I abandoned my desires and focused on comforting her. I tried to remind her of the joy in life. I told her that she was beautiful, and it would be a total waste. And doing what she intended to do didn't resolve anything, it just created more sadness. Now I'm older, I think I could have done a better job. I'm telling you this story as honestly as I can. And when she was crying in my car and talking about all of that, it freaked me out. After a while, she composed herself and thanked me. She said that she would do her best going forward, and we headed back to the car park. On the drive back, the atmosphere in the car was as heavy as lead. I tried to tell her funny anecdotes about me and my friends and my family, to get her spirits up and think about the positives in life. And I saw her smile. We got back to the car and I told her to really think about things, and I shook her hand. I remember her hand being particularly cold. Well, it was an odd night. I had a lot to consider on the drive home. There were no other cars on the road but mine. It took about an hour to get home, and I went straight to bed. In the morning I went downstairs and noticed a black envelope sticking out of my door. There was no address written on the front of it. I didn't like the look of it, but I opened it. "Thanks for tonight. The view was beautiful, and I had fun with you." No way! It was from her. I didn't even tell her my address, so I ran outside to see if I could spot her car, but it wasn't nearby. I was a bit freaked out by it. I tossed the letter in the trash and went about my day. Later that day, I went and fished the letter out of the trash again. We definitely didn't mention where we lived. I dumped it back in the trash and took the garbage outside on my way to go food shopping. I was gone for a couple of hours, and by the time I came back, I noticed that there was another black envelope in my mail slot. I began to tremble. Should I just throw it away or open it? I asked myself. I couldn't decide straight away. In the end, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. There were only a few words written on the letter this time. "Don't throw my letter away." I was really freaked out. Did I now have a stalker? What did all this mean? I didn't know what to do. I ended up calling a friend. I needed someone to talk to. I told them the whole story, and they wanted to see the letter. Well, my friend didn't really help much. He just kept saying he didn't understand her either. He told me not to throw the letter away. I was scared if I did, I would get more letters, so I agreed with him. I ended up tucking that letter away in a cardboard box with some forgettable things like old gas bills and electric bills. I shoved that box to the back of my closet and ended up forgetting about it. I saw that black envelope again a few years later when I was moving out. The fear that surrounded that letter and that woman had long subsided, so I decided to take the letter with me to the new house. If nothing else, it's a talking point, right? It went to the back of a new closet in the new house, and it was sealed away there, again for some time. So, I guess you're asking what the point of this story is, right? Well, the director of my company embezzled a huge amount of money, and then suddenly disappeared, leaving in his wake a huge amount of loan debt. That treacherous director was the one I spoke to about the black envelope. We were good friends, well, that's what I thought, until I found that he had signed my name as his sponsor against all of this insurmountable debt. Oh, it wasn't just corporate debt. He had borrowed from loan sharks as well. Collection agents came to our company looking for me on a regular basis. And this got out to our customers, and it caused us to lose employees. Customers told other customers, rival companies found out about the debt, and our name was mud. 10 years of hard work had come crashing down all around me. I lost the company that I had helped build, and all that remained was the mountains of debt attached to my name. I hated everything in life, and I saw no point going forward. I would often go on night drives with my dark thoughts, and one night I came to a decision. I didn't want to go on any longer. I got home and I saw something. There was a black envelope sticking out of my mail slot. Memories of that night, long ago, came rushing back to me. There was no fear, just a sense of understanding. Without hesitation, I opened the letter. I want to remind you of the joy of life. You are beautiful, and it would be a total waste. Doing what you intend to do isn't going to resolve anything except create more sadness. I was completely overwhelmed. I broke down and I cried. Tears flowed and flowed. She had remembered the exact words I had said to her. That letter is my prized possession. I live in poverty these days, but with positivity. I don't know who she is, or where she is, or even if she's real or some spirit guide, but I owe a lot to her, and I just hope this story helps whoever needed to hear it.
I had posted this in a different forum, maybe a year ago. But since I just discovered this subreddit today, I'm going to share it again. For my first birthday, many moons ago, my parents surprised me with a kitten. That kitten went through everything with me. Countless dance recitals, many nights of terrible instrument practicing, high school graduation, etc. She even slept in my bed most nights. She passed away 2 days after I turned 18. I didn't lose a pet that day. I lost a sibling, a best friend, and it was crushing. About 3 days after she passed, I was laying down trying to sleep when suddenly I heard her meow. My kitty had a very distinct, nasally meow, so I knew it was her. Of course, I jolt up. Why am I hearing my dead cat meowing? So as I'm looking around the room, I hear it again, next to my window. I heard it one more time, and then silence. Just deafening silence. I don't even remember hearing the crickets outside. I brought it up to my mom a few months later, and she told me, I bet you she just stopped by one last time to say goodbye. It made me feel so nice to think that she cared enough to make an extra stop on her way to the litter box in the sky.
Okay, so, for some context, my dad passed away at the very end of January this year. I suspect it was from an accidental overdose because of his substance abuse issues. But no one in the family wanted to look further into it, so we never got a further autopsy. I think his autopsy note said something like a heart attack. He usually texted and called me daily and saw me weekly. But after him not texting me for a few days, I got worried and I called the police to do a welfare check. An hour later, they called back with the news. Unfortunately, he is deceased. Those words run through my head now, all the time. I had deep regrets when he passed. He was always a hypochondriac, and also just coming up with excuses and minor problems that only I could be able to fix. I.e., the Netflix was broken. He usually just didn't know how to restart the PS3 when the app crashed. Or my rabbit, who he cared for, was sick. So when he texted me at odd hours, a couple of days before I called the police, saying that my rabbit wasn't eating, I didn't take him very seriously. I'd met him for lunch a day before he stopped responding, and he was very shaky and said he wasn't feeling well. but he said that weekly, so I figured I had no reason to worry. It's been the same story for years. Well, I was wrong. Once I got that phone call back saying he was gone, my world stopped. For the past several months, I've been fairly in denial. I went through his belongings after it happened, but my family wasn't interested in helping, and we ultimately ended up hiring a lady to do an estate sale for us. I grabbed what I could think to hold on to, and I ended up with a lot of stuff in boxes that I hadn't looked through too well. This will be relevant later. A few weeks ago, I had a dream. I haven't dreamed of him since he passed. When it first happened, I wished to see him, just one last time. But as time went on, I began to give up on seeing his ghost or presence one last time. That idea fully faded away. So I'm forever grateful for this experience I was given weeks ago. I dreamed that I was in a house I didn't recognize. It was clearly very old. My dad was born in 1947, if that holds any relevance to this house being so old. I walked up to a kitchen island and sat at a bar stool, which is when I see my dad, easily 20 years younger, walk out of a room opposite from me. A small brown and white dog that I'd never seen before comes out with him. I remember not being able to identify the breed, but the characteristics of the dog burned into my memory. Black nose, fluffy, brown with white blonde patches, and very small. He followed the dog, walking towards me. I forget how the conversation started, but I know I began crying rather quickly. He looked so good. He was wearing a long-sleeve blue patterned dress shirt he used to wear a long time ago. I cried, and he asked me, "What's wrong, kiddo? I'm better now. Don't you believe me?" And I responded with, "I do believe you. You look happier and healthier. That's why I'm crying." He told me not to worry. He would be okay, and so would I. And then he said goodbye, left the front door, and I woke up sobbing. It was a good bit of closure for me, and I've hung on to it since it happened. I figured my mind was creating that memory for me, to cheer me up and provide me with that closure. But 2 days ago, I started sorting through some stuff that's been in boxes for several months, and I came across a folder I don't remember. It was full of old pictures. His old girlfriends in the 60s and 70s, cars and stuff. I didn't remember grabbing it, but it was a nice bit of memories to hold on to. One picture stood out though. It made me genuinely lose my breath and tear up when I saw it. That exact same little dog from that dream, who I'd never seen in my life. A photograph that was decades old. I texted my aunt, and she confirmed that that was one of his favourite little dogs. I forget what she said his or her name was. I didn't even tell her what happened. I described the dog, and she told me how much he loved that dog without skipping a beat. I like to believe it really was my dad in that dream. He had the strength to come back and bring one of his favourite pups along with him, because he was a huge animal lover, and I wouldn't expect it any other way. I don't know what I believe happens to us when everything is over, but I believe wherever he is happy, and I am forever thankful for that.
This is my favorite story. When I first moved to Orlando, I got a job at a local company and needed to find a place to live. At the time, I was renting a room from a nice older couple. However, I was also getting married, so I needed to find a place for both of us to live. Those that live in Orlando know how expensive it can be, and I'm not much of an apartment guy. So, finally we found this nice little house, and when I say little, I mean little. Anyway, the landlord gave us a great deal cause he didn't want to really spend any time fixing it up, cause it wasn't worth it. After all, it was really small and really old. They had just moved his wife's mother to an elderly home, and he did fix the electrical and plumbing. I agreed that I would paint and fix things up so long as the basics worked. He was a really nice landlord, and we got along great. A few weeks after we moved in, the wife came by and let us know they would be away for a bit. Turns out her mom passed away a few days ago, and they were taking her back to the old country. I felt bad. I didn't know she was that sick, and we moved into her house. After that, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the air about the house changed a little, or at least I thought. Anyway, shortly later I got married and we settled into our daily lives. Well, I was working on the front porch when I found a small brooch under one of the rotten boards. It was pretty nice and brought it inside and placed it on the mantel. I figured I would give it to the landlord the next time I see him, cause it was most likely either Lillian's or his wife's. That was when things started to get weird. The first thing I started noticing, or more to the point my wife noticed and blamed me, was that the keepsakes from our wedding, champagne glasses, knives, photos, etc., got moved around and were not where she left them. I said I had nothing to do with them moving, but her being her wasn't having any of it. So, we moved them back. A few days later, we came home from dinner and there they were, rearranged, again. So, I looked over at her and asked her how I did it this time. The brooch was still in the same place on the mantel, but everything else had been moved around. That would happen a few more times until my now wife got over it and left them where they got moved to. One day I was dusting. Yeah, I know, a guy that dusts. Hey, I had to do something to stay on her good side. And came across the brooch on the mantel. As I looked at it, a breeze went by. It was just the fan. But that got me thinking about the odd things that have been happening. I started to think that maybe the events were Lillian's doing. I asked my wife what she thought, and she said that I was crazy. She is right, I am, but not the point though. That the ghost of the old lady that lived here was haunting the house and moving the wedding stuff around. Well, yeah, I said. She gave me that look and walked away. Anyway, the following weekend the landlord came by to mow the lawn and I went outside to give the brooch, thinking that wouldn't change anything. His wife was in the truck reading a book, and I walked over and handed her the brooch. Well, she turned about 10 shades of white and looked up at me and asked where I found it. I told her that I found it under the porch when I was fixing the floor. She said that this was her mother's and that she had lost it when she was a kid, and her mother was very mad at her for playing with it and losing it. She smiled and the color returned to her face and hugged me, and then I walked back to the house. As I walked up to the front, I looked at the house and noticed that in the front window there was a shadow behind the lace curtains, and it looked like maybe a person. As I walked closer, I tripped over a rock, and when I looked back up, it wasn't there. I went into the house and looked around and didn't see anything, so I moved on. A few days later, I get home and my wife starts rambling on about, do I smell the flowers? And she thinks we have mice or rats cause she keeps hearing movement. I say no, and I poke her a bit and say, does it sound like little feet or footsteps? She looks at me and then says, "Footsteps." After that, the events get more frequent and interesting. I'd be sitting on the couch and I would see out of the corner of my eye movement or a change of light. Not quite a shadow, but almost going from the kitchen to the bathroom, which is a straight shot and there isn't any way light can move that way back there. There were other things like strange sounds of things moving in the kitchen or the back bedroom. A lot of footsteps. The whole house is hardwood floors, it really carried. Little things like that. We never got touched or nothing bad ever happened to either of us. I decided that Lillian was still here after the brooch event. Maybe she was happy that I gave it back to her daughter, but it was still her house, so I figured she was well within her right to live here too. And besides, I love the way she messed with my wife. She is so easy. It even got to the point where sometimes I talked to Lillian. Never got a response back, and that was before cell phones or voice recorders were as high-tech as they are now. I'm not sure who she messed with more, me or my wife. We stayed in that house for 6 years and had 2 kids in that house before we moved to another city. Shortly after we moved, the landlord called and asked if anything strange had happened to us while we were in the house. I told him that his mother-in-law was still around and that she was super cool. He then said that's what he thought, because they were in there repainting and running ceiling fans, and they both had run-ins with something strange. I told him that she was good to us and that we missed living there. I hung up the phone and that was the last time I ever heard from him. I found out a few years later from some friends that the house was torn down and a new house had been put up in its place, way bigger than the original. I was a bit sad, but then I thought that Lillian might not like that very much, and that I hope she rearranges everything in the new house and drives the new owners crazy, like it did my wife.
This experience happened in May of 1979, when I was 15 years old. My maternal grandmother had passed, maybe a week or 2 before this event. I always loved going to her house as a child and spending the night. She was a wonderful grandma. She had moved to California after her last husband died in 1976, so I didn't get to see her for the last 3 years of her life. I was a freshman in high school, and in English class we were reading Romeo and Juliet. I had stayed up late that night while my parents slept to watch Romeo and Juliet on a local PBS station, so I was the only one awake at the time. I was laying on the floor of the living room with my pillow and blanket, with only the television on. A little explanation of how our house was laid out. The living room was in the front of the house, with the dining room and kitchen directly behind the living room. The area between the living room and dining room is completely open, while the kitchen area is blocked from the living room by the wall for the stairs that go into the basement. You could walk from the living room into the dining room, to the kitchen, into the front hallway, which brings you back into the living room. Between the kitchen and the front hallway are the basement stairs, and if you go the other direction, it's a hallway to the 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. On with the story. I was on the floor with a pillow and blanket watching the TV when I heard the sound of flip-flop shoes come from the kitchen into the dining room and right up behind my dad's reclining chair that was maybe 3 feet behind me. Now, my grandma always wore flip-flops in the summer. It was a sound that I associated with her. I've always loved the paranormal and accepted it as part of life. My mom had told me things that happened to her as a child and an adult ever since I was little, but when I heard the flip-flops, I was basically frozen in fear. I called out in a small voice, "Mom?" even though I knew it was not her. No answer. I knew she was sleeping and never wore those types of shoes, or even owned a pair of them. I can't even remember if I was brave enough to look behind the chair. I grabbed up my pillow and blanket, turned off the TV, and ran like a frightened rabbit. I'm not sure how I navigated the first corner. It was completely dark in the house, But when I made the second turn to go into the hallway to the safety of my room, I miscalculated the turn and ran directly into the wall. Luckily, I had my blanket draped over my arm, otherwise I might have broken it. When I hit the wall, all my mind could think was that I ran into a person, most likely the ghost of my grandma. I was struck with crazy terror before I figured out it was just the wall and that I'd made the turn too soon. In the safety of my room, lights on, door locked, and under my blanket, I slowly calmed myself down. I don't remember for sure, but I think I slept with the lights on that night. I told my mom about it the next morning. She asked me why I was so scared and made me realize that my grandma would never hurt me and that maybe she just wanted to see me one last time and say goodbye. That was so true. She wouldn't have hurt me. And as I've thought about it over the years, it's really very sweet that she came to me that night. There's no way that anyone will ever convince me that this didn't happen. I was 100% awake at that time, and it was most certainly my grandma. Years later, when my first child, my daughter, was 2, she came to me again, and that time I really believe she saved my life. I'll save that story for another time.
My mom has a million stories, some of them involving supernatural stuff. But this particular one, I was reminded of when I read a similar story. My mom was about 15 and had a younger friend that she would look out for and keep company, 2 or 3 years younger. She also worked in a donut shop. Her friend had an older sister. We'll call her Emily. She was 18 and also a friend of my mom's. Emily appreciated that my mom looked out for her little sister at school, since she was busy with senior year. Emily was apparently a total knockout, like the prettiest girl in town, easily. She also had a heart of gold. My mom stressed repeatedly how sweet this girl was. Well, she had just graduated high school and gotten a modeling gig. She was about to start a career and launch right into life, from a small rural town. Apparently, right before she was supposed to leave town, she came to visit my mom to say goodbye. She'd popped into the donut shop one morning to tell my mom goodbye, thank you for everything, and to keep an eye on her little sister. My mom found out later that Emily had died in a car accident the night before she came to visit. She is and will always be convinced that Emily appeared to her to make sure that her little sister would be taken care of after she was gone. Her sister apparently was never the same after this happened, of course. It really rocked this small town. Anyway, it was a short one. I swear it's true, or at least my mom swears it's true. And I believe her.
I was born when my parents were both 42. I am the only child they shared, although they had both had previous marriages and bore 2 children each. I'm personally of the opinion that this is a little late in life to be having a baby. When I was about 7, some classmates and I were discussing the ages of our parents. When it was my turn, one girl exclaimed, "What? They're gonna die when you're like 10. I thought this was pretty rude, but wasn't too bothered by it. Later that year, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and after 3 years of suffering, she passed away due to complications, which is a whole hospital horror story. I went back to school a week or so later. That girl approached me and said, "When I heard about your mum, I cried. My sister said, 'Why are you crying? You didn't even know her.' I recalled the now painful prediction she had made, and could see that she didn't consciously remember, but a part of her did. So I had to grow up without my mother. It caused me to come to terms with my own mortality and see the circle of life turning. I moved about 700 kilometers away from where I grew up, had 5 children, and built myself a life that is very close to nature. my father was challenged by all this. He was always telling me that I was worrying him and giving him grey hair. I ended up giving him a copy of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. This really changed him. Like me, Christianity did not really vibe with him, but I swear, reading that book took him closer to enlightenment. After that, he seemed to relate to me a lot better. Most school holidays, I would take the kids to stay with Dad and his wife. He remarried his first wife. It was so nice to be able to spend time with him like that. His wife mostly seemed put out by my presence. It destroyed the delusion she liked to have that she never left him and had a whole other life while Dad and Mum were together. So I was a bit of an inconvenience in that way. I decided to give them some space for a couple of years. By the time we visited again, things had changed. As in, Dad had gone downhill. His posture was the most obvious. He had gone from being so straight that he had corners. My favorite description of his personality also suited his posture. To having slouched shoulders, stooped neck, and holding his hands up as he walked. When I saw this, my brain went and said, "Damn, you look like you hit your use-by date." I really hate how right that was. It took the doctor 12 months to figure out what was happening. One symptom that alarmed me was difficulty swallowing and sometimes choking on his food. That turned out to be a huge indicator. He had motor neuron disease. If not medicated early enough, a patient will only live for 2 years. He passed away about 2 years ago, so that left me with no parents. All of a sudden, there was no higher safe place for me to go, no protection. I felt exposed to the universe, like the pinnacle of a pyramid. I was now the only protection in my lineage for my children. I am responsible for everyone. This began to weigh heavily on me. About a year after my father's death, I fell into a depression. I lost my happy-go-luckies. The way I just wake up with the sun and my base emotion is happy. I really didn't want to do anything. I began to sleep. A lot. Have you ever overslept? Like, say, a few hours? You'll probably find it difficult to go to sleep that night. Well, that wasn't happening with me. I could sleep and sleep and sleep. I knew it wasn't normal. It began to astound me. Honestly, I would spend about 4 hours awake. This began to annoy my family, but they didn't hassle me too much. They recognized that I was going through something. I don't dream often, so when I had this dream, I took notice. I was at my dad's place cooking corned beef. My stepmother came into the kitchen and started talking to me. I was then surprised to see Dad. The circumstances were that after the corned beef was done, I would be on my way to somewhere else. There was this business and pressure to the situation. He was just catching up with me before we both had to be on our own ways. This was comforting and nice, but I didn't really think much of it. About 2 weeks later, there was another dream. This time we were meeting for lunch. Again, while I was on my way to another destination. It was a happy reunion. We would meet up for lunch like this when he was alive, me and the kids, him and his wife. It was so lovely. And in the end, we all went to do our own things. Not long after that, my motivation slowly returned. Some level of happiness crept back to me. I got up, I did some chores, picked up my crafts again, and I look back on those dreams with misty eyes and I think, thank you, Dad. You haven't abandoned me. You still care. I feel like the message of those dreams is, yes, my daughter, I have gone, but the earth still turns. The sun still shines. Your children are growing, and your life can't wait for you. Go on and live. I lost my mother when I was 10, and my dad when I was nearly 40. I can say that when you have good people in your life, they are never live long enough. Love you so much, Mum and Dad. Thanks for everything. And may we meet again someday.
I want to keep this short as it's very personal. My husband died when he was quite young. We both knew that it was coming, as he had developed a serious illness a few years back. His illness meant that he had lost his ability to drive. At the time he lost his license, I didn't have one myself. I knew that driving was a big part of his life, and he loved it. So I applied for my license, and everything was going well. I passed the practical test, but I failed the written test. I'm such a dumbass. It broke my heart that I failed because I wanted to do so much for him. I was so disappointed on the day I got those test results. I wanted to pass so badly. I wanted to help, and I felt so stupid. I thought he would be just as disappointed as I was, but he wasn't. He comforted me. He was such a great husband. Come on, don't be down. You were so close last time. Listen, imagine I am right behind you. I know you can do it. I took the second test and I failed again. I cannot tell you how disappointed I was. Maybe I was feeling the pressure of what it meant, or I had too much going on, but I know that these are nothing but excuses. Eventually, his condition worsened, and unfortunately, he passed away. I guess that I didn't need to take that test anymore, but I felt like I should. I felt like I should try, like there was someone cheering me on. So test day arrived again. As usual, I rode my bike to the test center. The bike I had these funky mirrors attached to the handlebars. I realize now that I had become a very cautious person. Safety was really important to me back then. I guess you understand why. I checked the mirrors regularly. There was no one behind me as I rode down the street. I then took another look in the mirror, and suddenly there was someone stood in the road behind me. It looked like they were waving. Was that you? Were you right behind me like you promised? I passed the test, by the way. I remember that it was a sunny day. I rode my bike to the place I met my husband and stayed there for a long time. I'm so grateful for everything. Thank you.
I grew up on a small farm in south central Pennsylvania. Our house was built in the mid to late 1800s and had several occupants before my parents moved in, one of which we believed stuck around after death. We called this entity Joe, after a farmer that lived there that was killed in an accident not far from the house. Both my family and several friends had seen Joe around the property. Joe would appear in a window of the old barn before the barn was destroyed. He would also make his presence known around the house, moving things, whispering, and occasionally manifesting himself for people to see. He appeared for a group of people that we had visiting in the early 90s, this faculty from a boarding school my mother taught at. Several of the teachers asked who the old man standing on our second floor balcony was. They all thought he was a new teacher at the school, but when they asked my mum and went to show her the man, he was gone. My first time seeing Joe was in the early 90s. I had heard him and seen things moving on their own since I was a kid, but never actually saw him before. This was when I was in high school, maybe grade 9 or 10. I was homesick for the day. My parents were both at work and my brother was off at college. We lived at a crossroad in a 2-story house on 5 acres of land. At the time we had a small barn with a large pasture for several sheep and goats. The windows of my second floor bedroom overlooked the barn and the pasture to the north and the crossroad to the west. Anyway, at one point in the early afternoon, a noise caught my attention and I peeked out the window to see what it was. The animals had somehow opened one of the gates and escaped the pasture. I groaned and got dressed to get them back in the fenced area. I was sick and did not want to deal with this. Before leaving my room, I looked out the window again, and to my surprise, saw a man herding the animals back into the pasture and latching the gate. He was older, maybe in his 60s or 70s, wearing glasses, black pants, and suspenders with a white button-down shirt. When he was done, he turned to look directly at my window, smiled and waved, and started walking toward the road. I watched him walk off in disbelief. When I couldn't see him anymore from that window, I went to the other window to see where he was going. He had disappeared. There was no sign of him walking down the road, and there was no vehicle that he could have arrived in. There was also no time for him to have gotten into a vehicle and driven off. He was just gone. I haven't seen Joe since then, but my parents still live there today and report that he's still around, making his presence known with whispering and playful moving of objects.
During the summer, I lost my grandaunt Helena, and she was my maternal grandmother's sister. My grandma came from Aegio, in the region of Peloponnesus in Greece, where we visited the family tombstone and paid our respects to the last departing grandparent. The cemetery is so beautiful and well taken care of, and it was just pure peace. The cemetery was public owned, which surprised me, because in Greece cemeteries aren't that well taken care of, or at least those I have visited in the past. It was quite frankly a shock, and it was so big it stretched over a small hill going at least 3 miles long if you walked around it. The earliest grave there was from 1816 as well, which also shocked me. I felt so calm there, like when you enter a library. It was super hot the entire day, and in the cemetery there was a perfect cool breeze, and yet I felt so warm and content. I felt at peace. However, when I visited my paternal grandma's grave specifically, I felt this chill and had a vibe of unrest. That cemetery was cold and angry where my maternal grandpa and grandma were buried, the one I visited as a kid. And it has this restless calm. But this cemetery in Aegio was a completely different experience. I'm still in disbelief as to what I experienced there. I felt like I was being hugged by all my ancestors and that I was being welcomed. I actually felt a warm glow, and I didn't want to leave. I looked at the family grave and I said a soft hi and a nice to meet you in a low voice so my parents wouldn't think I was crazy. The moment I said it though, I felt this warm hand on my shoulders and I felt like crying. I'm even blinking tears away whilst typing this, and I did the same then too. Now I've never met my grandfathers, and I never met my granduncles or grandaunts old enough to be able to have a conversation with. I was 5 or 6 years old when I last saw any of them, and I was 10 when the last granduncle died. I wasn't able to go to the funeral, and my paternal grandmother died before I could say goodbye, and so did my maternal grandma. My grandfathers died before I could meet them also, and it used to make me sad. I wondered why and how things would have been otherwise, and I had years of having dreams of being with them in my great-grandpa's shop, my aunt's house, or it would be an old Athenian coffee shop from the 1950s. I felt lighter and happier leaving, although I didn't want to, and it was like I'd made peace with how things were, and I knew that they knew I existed, and that I loved them even though I'd never met them. They knew that things were complicated with the other family members, and that they didn't hate me because I was related to them or was the offspring of them. This was the most peaceful experience I have ever had in a cemetery, and I wanted to share it with you all.
I was 8 years old when my grandpa died. He had had a heart attack and passed on Easter Sunday morning that year. It was extremely hard on all of us because he was pretty young, late 50s, and it was fairly preventable. He was addicted to smoking cigarettes, and it caused him to have a lot of issues with his heart. This stressed my mum out and made her smoke even more. She was 31, but had been smoking since she was a teenager. She had a heart attack less than 2 months after his death. I understand that her age might make it hard to believe, but she really did have a serious heart attack at that age. I only mention my mum's health here because it's important to why I'm not home during this story. My sister and I stayed at my grandma's apartment while my mum was in hospital. My dad wanted to be with her for obvious reasons, and my uncle, my mum's brother, drove up so that he could be close by in case things got worse. We all slept over at my grandma's. My sister, 6, my cousin, 6, slept with my grandma in her bed. My uncle was still at the hospital with my dad, so I slept with my aunt in the living room. I was in the recliner, and she took the couch. The recliner faced a very narrow hallway on the right side of the living room. There weren't any windows that could shine lights from outside in. My aunt went to the bathroom at the end of the hallway, and my grandma was with my sister and cousin in her room, so I was alone, watching Three's Company in the living room. I happened to look down the hallway. On the end of the right side of the hall was my grandpa's old room. They slept in different rooms because he had a very loud CPAP machine. I swear on everything that he was there, walking down the hallway. I could only see him from his shoulders up, but I know that it was him. There wasn't any other light that could reach that angle. No cars passing could have shone their light up that high and all the way to the back. The only window nearby was all the way to the left of the living room. I wasn't scared of him, but I was startled by seeing something coming at me so unexpectedly. So little me screamed my head off, and he disappeared. Grandma came rushing out of her room to see what had happened. I honestly don't remember if I told her that I saw him. I don't remember much of my night after that. I'd feel awful if I scared him away from me. My mum woke up from her surgery before my dad or anyone else was in the room with her. She says the first thing she remembers is my grandpa holding her hand and telling her it was all going to be okay. She went back to sleep. When she woke back up, she wrote down the word Dad, followed by a question mark. She still had the tubes down her throat, so she couldn't actually speak. She wanted to see him. My father looked at the paper and had to remind her that he wasn't with us anymore. She just broke down into tears. I didn't know about this incident until earlier this year, and I never talk about the night I saw him walking down the hallway of his old apartment. I think he just wanted to check in on all of us to make sure that we were okay. I just wanted to ramble about this because it still makes me sad and I miss him very much. It's hard to format this into a true story mode because it does make me emotional, but I hope I did well enough. The anniversary of his death was a few weeks ago, and this time of year always makes me think of this incident. My mum's heart attack will have happened 15 years ago this June. Maybe it was just an emotionally stressful time, or maybe we're both crazy, but I like to believe in my 8-year-old brain. I like to think that it was real, and not a child's hyperactive imagination. I like believing in my mum's experience with seeing him there, so clearly holding her hand. He was the type to do that. It's a bit wild that the times we both saw him, we were so close to each other, but I guess that might make sense too, if he had a chance to come visit us one last time.
My maternal grandparents lived in Nebo, Missouri, a little community in the Mark Twain National Forest. We lived in Springfield, making for a couple hours trip when we'd visit for holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, even the 4th of July sometimes. And sometimes they'd have one of us kids visit for a few days. In 2006, my grandmother had a stroke and had to be put in a facility to monitor her state. Her mental state never recovered, and the last photos of her I saw were nearly unrecognizable. All of us were preparing ourselves for the inevitable. that we'd have to say goodbye for the last time. Then, one Sunday morning, my father answered a phone call, and shortly after, the younger of my two sisters started crying. When we asked what the problem was, she said, "Grandpa died." His health had broken down, and despite the attempt to get him medical attention, he'd gone quickly. That Wednesday, we had the funeral and burial. Given her physical and mental state, Grandma couldn't be there. In a couple days, we got the news that Grandma had died peacefully, and we had a second funeral and burial about a week after her husband. Now for the ghostly part. At the family meetings and such after the second funeral, a little story got out. Grandma had been informed that her husband had died, but on hearing this news, she protested that couldn't be, as he was still visiting her. Now, as I said, after the stroke, Grandma's mental state wasn't quite all there. But what if she was right? What if my grandfather was still visiting her? Did he not want to go without her? During my first 20 years, I never questioned that they loved each other. Maybe that love was enough to keep them together, even after one of them had already died.
So this didn't happen to me, but my close friend's little cousin. Let's call her Angie. She was 5 years old at the time, and I remember hearing about how her mum used to have encounters with the paranormal often. But as she got older, she shut them out. So I guess these talents were passed on to her daughter. One day, Angie was playing while her Uncle Ben was watching her. He asked her who she was playing with, and she said it was her imaginary friend. Not unusual for kids to have imaginary friends, so Ben didn't think much of it. What Angie didn't know is that many years ago when Ben was a child, he had a friend named Corey. Ben and Corey were having a play date, and Corey borrowed a pair of Ben's shoes. When Corey went home, he was still wearing Ben's shoes, and he died in a car crash. Ben decided to leave the shoes on and bury Corey in them, out of respect. Little Angie had never been told this information, as she was only 5 years old. This is the chilling part. She continues to talk to her imaginary friend, and Ben is engaging with her, until Angie stops, looks at Ben, and says, "His name is Corey. He says he's sorry he still has your shoes." And this is not the only time I've heard of stories like this from my friend, the cousin of Angie. Angie is now probably 13 or so, and I wonder if she still has these abilities. Either way, every time I hear this story, it never fails to send chills down my spine. I'd like to share this experience with others because it's been a beautiful and perplexing thing for us. This is the kind of story I had previously heard about, but when it happens to you, it really is quite amazing. Sorry it's long. In April 2020, my partner and I sadly lost a son at 17 weeks gestation. I had an infection in my uterus, which was undetected, and after several days in hospital with some worrying symptoms, I went into premature labor. I was also septic, so after delivering our boy, I was very unwell. To say it was tragic and traumatic would be an understatement. We named him, and for the purposes of this post, we'll call him H. At that time, my older son, A, was 2.5 years old. Too young to really understand anything except that Mummy was sick in hospital. We haven't purposely not told him about H. We will in time. But there was no reason to confuse him at such a young age. We don't talk a lot about H at home. H is not a name that is familiar to our older son for any reason. In around July this year, I was driving A to a Saturday morning activity when he said, "Mummy, you should meet my friend H. He's here in the car with us." and pointed to the ceiling of the car. I didn't want to overreact or ask too much in case he felt the need to make things up, so I simply said, "That's good, eh? Is he a nice friend?" And he said, "Yes." I told my partner, and we both had the same reaction. Weird coincidence, but also, kids have imaginary friends often, so not a big deal. The next day, A told my partner that H is here when they were playing in our lounge room. My partner asked, "Oh, okay. Where is he now?" And A pointed in the air to the corner of the room, above where we keep H's ashes, on the top of our bookshelf. A then said, "He's like an astronaut. He can float in space." A few days later, when my partner took A off to childcare, I gave A a kiss and a hug as I always do at the front door. A then turned to his left and enthusiastically says, "Bye, H. I'm off to school," before running out the door. Now, my partner and I are just looking at each other in amazement. Over the next few weeks, this happened several more times. Sometimes, A told us that H is asleep, so we'd stay in the car if we arrived at our destination. A also told me that H was in hospital, not an astronaut anymore. This time freaked me out a little, as of course the only time we could hold H was in hospital. Our only memories of him physically were in that setting, but mostly these visitations felt special and a bit magical. The final time H visited, that we know of, occurred in the car again. Just A and I. He told me, "H is here with us, Mummy," and curiosity got the better of me. I asked, "A, is H a man or a little boy like you?" He said to me with a tone like I really should know this already, "No, Mummy, H is just a little baby. Sometimes I can hold him." And he cradled his arms like he was holding a small baby. That was absolutely an oh shit, but also wow moment. I was raised agnostic atheist, so it's all a bit overwhelming to ponder on too much. But we have decided it was H just letting us know he's okay, and with us still somehow. A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant again. I like to think H was here with us through the early weeks, and is with us still, as a special part of our family. I do believe young children can see things we can't explain, so I'm glad A had this chance, though he most likely won't remember it. Thanks for listening. So, this might not be that extraordinary, but it still was very odd, to me at least. First off, I was very close to my grandmother. I was her first grandchild and we had the most amazing bond. Now, as a 27-year-old man, I still occasionally feel this happy urge to go and visit her, even though she has been gone for years. She taught me a lot of things, including gardening, which was one of her favorite things to do. We used to garden together, which later made me buy my own allotment to grow vegetables and flowers. So I had owned said allotment for a couple of weeks when my grandmother came to visit me. She was so proud with what I had done to the place. And then she told me she had cancer and that she probably wouldn't survive for long enough to see all my flowers in the garden blossom. That broke my heart. Within weeks, she was in intensive care. When I visited her in hospice just hours before she died, she was in a coma, and I begged her to let go, which she did. My family owns a house just by a fjord river. My grandparents also used to have a house there, so my grandmother had wished to have her ashes spread over the water, so she would still be close to us. I had picked her favorite flowers, freesias, from my allotment as my last gift to her. I put the flowers in the water, as well as a sip of beer which she also enjoyed. 2 weeks later, I get a call from my mum. She just wanted me to know that 3 yellow freesias had appeared on their private pier overnight. The flowers are not indigenous to my country, and actually quite rare to come across, and they were just as fresh as if they had been just cut. Needless to say, we were all shocked. Mostly because only my mum and me knew that yellow freesias were her favourite. My dad and brothers would have never thought of it, let alone pulled a prank on us. As a reminder, I have a freesia tattooed on my arm. The new house I built on my allotment bears her name, and every spring I plant dozens of freesia bulbs in her memory. It could all be a mean prank, but in my heart, I know it wasn't. She just wanted to let me know she was still around. This is going to be short, so bear with me. Very recently, my cat, Mr. Fat, was attacked and sadly didn't make it. He left on September 16th, 2019. But a couple of weeks later, after I buried him and said my final goodbyes, Mr. Fat decided it wasn't the end, and he wanted to be with me one last time. I was asleep and, of course, dreaming. I remember every detail about my dream. I was in an all-white room, sitting on a blue rug or carpet, and I heard my cat. He did his usual greeting, which is a simple meow. He came around me and rubbed himself on me. I started crying and pulled him into my lap. While kissing and petting him, I went, "Mr. Fat, why are you here? I thought you died." And I cried even more. I petted him, and he purred, and then suddenly he got up and started walking away. I yelled at him, "Where are you going? Come here, Mr. Fat." He stopped walking, turned around and come back to me, rubbing his body against me, and in tears I went, "I miss you so much," and I gave him a small kiss on his head. He turned around and started walking again. I, for some reason, couldn't lift my head to watch him leave. And once his tail and feet was out of view, I woke up the next morning. After my dad died of a sudden heart attack when I was 24, I was in a daze. I still lived at home and we rented, and the owner wanted to move back into his house. We didn't have a pot to piss in, but my dad came across a house in foreclosure that we could afford. It could only be in mine and my mum's name because my dad's credit tanked after his health and business failed. The bank put new appliances in this house, but someone broke in and stole them. My dad and mum went to change the locks, and they unknowingly bought a defective lock. Trying to put it in the door stressed my dad out so much he collapsed. This was 1998, so no cell phones and our home's phone wasn't hooked up yet. My mum ran to the neighbors, but they didn't answer the door. She ran to the next house, and luckily they answered and called 911. When my mum got back to my dad, she attempted CPR, but she said she could tell he was gone. The medics worked on him, but it was too late. The phone rang at home and my brother said, "Dad had a heart attack," and drove us to the hospital. My brother took it particularly hard and fell into drugs and subsequent psychosis and homelessness. I had a very hard time getting over my dad's death. I couldn't sleep and thought I saw him sitting in his truck that stayed parked in the driveway. I believed those were grief hallucinations. However, I had a dream one night. My dad was there, and he looked healthy and happy. We were sitting at the bottom of a hill. The top of the hill had a water well with a bucket and crank. The sky was really blue, and the grass on the hill was really green. I remember the colors being very crisp and bright. My dad was smiling and happy, and he told me everything was fine and not to be sad. Then he got up and walked over that hill, and he was gone. It was comforting because I was really struggling with accepting his death. I woke up from that dream and went to the kitchen to get some water. The refrigerator door was wide open, and I felt irritated. I thought my brother did it, but he wasn't home. My aunt, my dad's sister, asked me to retell her that dream every time I talked to her. While talking about my dad, She said they promised each other that whoever died first would give a sign to the other that all was okay. My dad told her he would leave her refrigerator door open. I didn't know this. Being such an odd way to say "don't worry, I'm fine" was supposed to leave out any ambiguity. I told her about finding our refrigerator door wide open that night. We knew it had to be my dad. My aunt passed away 2 years ago, and now they're together with their mum. So, it was 2001, and at the time I was 9 years old, living with my 2 younger brothers, 6 and 3, and my single mother. One morning, my great-grandma passed away in her sleep. Absolutely devastated, my great-grandfather called my mum to come over and help handle her things and sort the funeral arrangements with him. We were always very close with those great-grandparents. Unfortunately, they lived 5 hours away from us, and my mother couldn't drive. So my great-grandfather got in his 3-seater truck and came to get her and my 3-year-old brother. My mum couldn't get a babysitter, so she left me to watch my 6-year-old brother, as I had on other occasions. Gave me the only key to the house in case we wanted snacks from the convenience store down the street, and told me to keep the door locked until she gets home, and to just look out the upstairs window if anyone comes knocking. She called to check on us 6 hours later, and told me that she has more to deal with at their house than she'd thought, and would come home the next day, as my great-grandfather had poor night vision and couldn't drive a long trip at night. So, we kept the door locked, and my brother and I stayed up late watching TV. Around 3 a.m. I took my brother up to his bed and went back down to the couch to watch more TV. Eventually falling asleep at 4 a.m. on the couch, I had a dream. I was in my great-grandma's garden. She was sitting on their bench by a tree feeding the blue jays. They were always her favorite. She turned to me, smiled and said, "I'm okay. Be good. I love you." I woke up and it was 6 a.m, still dark out. But I had a blanket on me. But to my absolute shock, it was one my great-grandma had been knitting for me. I sprinted around the house, and my mum wasn't home. My brother was asleep. The doors and windows were all locked still. So I called my great-grandparents' house. My mum answered, groggy and confused as to why I was calling so early. I asked her about the blanket. She said she saw it in my great-grandma's armchair the other day and was planning on bringing it back for me. She hadn't come home and couldn't find a blanket. No one else had the key to the house, and I'm a very light sleeper. So I believe my great-grandma came to tuck me in one last time. To this day, none of my family can explain it, but I'm glad she's okay. And Nana, I love you too. This happened to my daughter, who will be 15 tomorrow, when she was around 2 or 3. One of our dearest friends passed away very suddenly of a massive heart attack at his home. We lived about a mile away, and one of the first responders knew how close we all were, so they called us when the call came in. It was around 5:30 a.m. My husband went to their house and beat the emergency response team there. When we first got the call, I got up and went into the living room. I shut our bedroom door. At the time, our daughter slept with us. It was around 6:15 a.m. when he called me to tell me that our friend had passed. He was going to stay there with our friend's wife until the coroner came. I stayed up and just tried to pass time. Our friend's wife had called me at one point and asked that I call her sister. It was around 10 a.m. when my daughter woke up. She was all sleepyhead and adorable. She crawled up in my lap and snuggled. She so sweetly says, "Jeffrey Cooper came and see me." I said, "Oh really, sissy?" She said, "Yep, he came and see me and told me bye." Jeffrey Cooper was our friend's name that passed. She was so little and said his full name, plain as day. There is absolutely no way she could have known he passed. No way she could have just said his name, and that he came to see her. She was so little, and she was in the bedroom with the door shut. The only time I talked to anyone that morning was on the phone, and it wasn't like I was shouting as loud as I could. I talked to the first responder on the phone when they called early that morning. At no time did I say our friend's name out loud. The next time I was on the phone, I was in the living room, and again, I never said Jeff's full name, and I never spoke loud enough for her to hear all the way in the bedroom with the door shut. I like to believe it really was him coming to say goodbye. From about 8 years old, I have always seen things, but my parents assumed it was just my imagination. I suppose that they were right to an extent, as I did have a very active imagination, which is what brought me closer to my Uncle Harry. Now, Uncle Harry, for as long as I could remember, was bedridden, and he could not really speak. But nonetheless, every time we would visit my Aunt Grace, his wife, I would find myself talking to him and playing games. I always had fun when we went to visit, much to the discomfort of my sister and other cousins who found him creepy. I can't blame them. We were all so little and had never been exposed to someone so ill before. As time had passed, we visited less as my uncle was getting worse. The years went on, and the fact we now lived about 2 hours away made it difficult to visit. My sister and I had just started 3rd grade at a brand new school. Now, since we went to a Catholic elementary school, we would line up in the hallways against the walls to perform the end-of-day prayer. During the lineup, I was positioned in front of the band room, which had a large glass window on the door. I turned to look into the room and saw my Uncle Harry in an all-white suit sitting in one of the chairs. I waved to him, and he waved back, and I turned around as the bell had rung for dismissal. My sister and I met my mum in the cafeteria where student pickup was, and we began to walk out when I stopped my mum and told her we couldn't leave. She asked me why, and I told her because Uncle Harry was here, and we couldn't leave him. I assumed he came with my mum to pick us up from school. My mum looked at me, confused, and said, Uncle Harry was back home with my Aunt Grace. I fought her all the way home about this, and described what I saw, but she did not listen. We arrived home, and the phone was ringing. My mum answered it, and it was my Aunt Grace. She had called to tell us my Uncle Harry had passed away that morning, and she had been trying to call my mum, but she was picking us up from school. My mum turned to me and put me on the phone with my Aunt Grace. I told her what happened, and she said that it was my Uncle Harry saying one last goodbye. Ever since that day, my mum and her side of the family never doubted when I saw or heard something ever again. When I was 4 years old, I moved from my home country to Spain, and I started to live in a small house that belonged to my great-grandfather. I never met him, obviously. Neither had my mother. My grandpa stayed in my home country, and I had almost no contact with him. The house was small, 1-bedroom house in the middle of a big garden and with maybe 2 or 3 other houses around, but quite far. I was sleeping in a big bed with my mother and sister. I was really restless, so I was always sleeping in the middle, just so I didn't wake up in the middle of the night and go out and play in the garden or in the salon. The first months were normal, but after 4 or 5, my mother started asking why I was waking up in the middle of the night and sitting down on the bottom of the bed. I remember that every night I was waking up, and there was one old lady in a white dress, with a lace collar on the edge, just staring at me. I never felt scared or in danger. It was totally the opposite. I was feeling very calm, and that lady never had an angry face, always happy. I still remember the features of her face, her white hair, everything. My mother woke up a couple of times and she saw me at the bottom talking to someone, but she never saw anyone with me. I told her that I was with the old lady, and she started to feel really upset and scared at the same time. She forbid me to wake up again, and, well, I kept seeing her every night, till one night she disappeared. I remember that we were talking about normal things like if I liked the house, if I had friends, how I was feeling, etc. Nothing weird. After 4 or 5 years, we moved from that house to another in another town, where I was living for 12 years. My grandpa decided to move finally to the same country, and he decided to live in the house where his parents lived. One holiday, me being about 12 or 13 years old, I decided to come back to stay with him for a month. During one normal conversation, I commented to him about that experience. I described the lady, the clothes, and everything, and then he suddenly started crying. It seems that I was watching his mother, and I described her exactly as she was buried a long time ago. This happened in 2000, and she died in 1962. After that, I remember that we went to the cemetery and put flowers on her grave. I cannot describe the feeling when, after that many years, I saw her grave and felt so calm and in peace. I don't know if someone has ever experienced this, and I'm so sorry if you found this boring or not interesting, but I've never told this to anyone. Thanks for listening. I have been sensitive to spirits all my life, both good and bad, and I was lucky enough to have a mother who was too, so I never had to worry about running to her if something scared me or I couldn't figure it out. When I was 14 in 1980, I had just had a major surgery and was in the Holy Cross Hospital in Utah. It was the 4th of July night, and I was on the 5th floor. I was in a 2-bed room and had the bed by the window. I could see far across the Salt Lake Valley, and I was enjoying all the fireworks when a nurse, one having a bad day I guess, came marching in and said I was supposed to be sleeping. She closed my window curtains and then pulled the curtains around my bed to shut off my view of anything or anybody. I don't recall how long I laid there before I started to get my telltale feelings that a spirit was near. I would get these feelings of electric waves rushing through my body, with a heaviness pushing down on you that felt like you were surrounded in a crowded room, though you were there alone. I made a firm decision that I was going to be brave and confront this spirit, as I knew there would be no help if I called the nurse. I balled up handfuls of sheet in my hands, as if that would give me strength, and I asked out loud, "Who is it? Who's here?" About 2 feet above my head, a head appeared. No body, just a head as real as if someone was there. It was a very old lady with curly, short white hair, lots of wrinkles, and black trimmed glasses. She answered me with a very firm, "It's me, goddammit." And then she blinked out and the room once again became calm. The next morning my mum came to visit me, and I was telling her about my experience. As I was describing this lady and telling her what she said, my mum just busted out laughing. She told me that that was my great-grandma Bird, and that she actually died in this hospital. She told me that Grandma Bird swore like a sailor. Apparently she had died when I was only 1, so I had no memories of her.
Hi, my name is 242, and I got a few ghost stories, but Papa Scare specifically wants something wholesome and sad. So let me start this back when I was about 7 or 8. I was looking at the computer, wanting to make my first ever email. My nephew was in the room with his mother, my older sister Carlene. I looked over her and said, "I don't know what to make my email name." Carlene looked at me, thinking, "You're worried you'll forget?" I nodded. "How about you make it 242 and make the password Zoo?" Yes, this was a long time ago. You could make your password that simple. So I typed in 242 and made my password zoo. Also, I forgot that password. I was 7 or 8. Give me a break. Time passed. Carlene was 11 years older than me. I didn't really grow up with her. She was already pretty much gone by the time I was starting to make memories. And she had her son at about 19 or 20. And I'm telling you this to also say I don't have that much memories of her, but I have a lot of good ones. When I was 13, and I know for a fact I was 13, my sister took her own life. She used to come over every Sunday with her son, but that Sunday before that, she didn't. And I knew something was off. She had actually had her son taken away from her through that week due to some things that had happened. And I had a very sinking feeling something was wrong. But I was so young, no one would have listened to me. Before I continue with the story, please, if you feel like this, if you feel like you don't want to go on, or that you don't feel like waking up tomorrow, please reach out to someone. You are loved, you are cared for, and your disappearance will affect more people than you can realize. Because sadly, my sister Carlene didn't know how much she was actually loved, and there was no way for us to help her once she was gone. So there are numbers all over the world for crisis like this. Please, either reach out to someone you trust or get one of these numbers and please call. Because you don't want to go down this path. It's just not a way you can ever go back. Carlene didn't. She was alone and didn't find the help, and she was in pain, and the hole that she left has never been filled in my family. Now, with all that out of the way, let me get to the ghost story part. This all happened during the summer and fall just after she had passed away. Her son, my nephew, were in the backyard in the pool. We were playing, and then we heard the cabinets opening and closing. Something Carlene did a lot, and truth be told, I do to this day. We never locked our front door at the time, or even after this. It took me a little bit to get brave enough. Again, I was 13 and he was like 6 years old. And I walked into the kitchen and it was empty. The whole house was empty. And my nephew had heard it too. We both were staring at each other in the pool, completely afraid of what we were going to find inside. Also, this was the middle of the day, not nighttime. I want to say like 1 o'clock latest. Some more time passes, and I was on the deck that was outside the family room. Now, the family room had some steps, and it was actually a bit lower than the rest of the house. And I was sitting on a chair, talking on the phone, looking at the other patio door that had no deck at the time, that was in the dining room. And it led to a drop. There was absolutely nothing there. There stood Carlene. She was waving at me to come to her. I don't even remember who I was on the phone with anymore. I just know I was scared AF. I went inside and no one was in the dining room. The house, as always, in the middle of the day, was empty. This happened once again. School had started back up, and I was at that deck once more. I truly can't remember why I was, and she was at that dining room door yet again, waving at me to come to her. Scared, I sat or stood there for a while. I can't remember what I was doing, but I know I was home alone again, and my sister, my dead sister, was at that window once more, and I was home alone in the middle of the day. I went inside, and she was gone. That was the last time I saw her. Found out years later her ashes were in the dining room. It was in this metal sealed container. I think she wanted to tell me something, but I'll never be 100% sure of what she wanted to. My best guess is because, since a child, I have seen ghosts, and I was the only one in the house who believed in them at the time. So maybe she wanted to reach out to me to remind me not to go down her path. Please take care, and remember, not all ghosts want to hurt us, but trust your gut, always. For that saved me from something that did mean to do me harm in the future, in that house.
Just recently, my poor town was hammered by a rain bomb that flooded the town out, drowned it for the first time in its 140-odd years of history. It's used to getting flooded, but not like this. It rose over the levee, 15 to 16 meters high. Fast, flowing water caught us all unaware. Now for my story. I'm a member of a volunteer organisation, an emergency service that specialises in storm and water, land searches and flood rescues. That's what I am, a flood operator. Just a fancy name for being a rescuer. My job is to seek, locate and perform rescues, mostly risking our lives to save others. I've done many. My mate, Simon, and I, we were on the Archangel, a large zodiac, and were going down the flooded streets. Streetlights were out, but the beam of ours was bright enough to navigate through floating debris. We called out, but no one answered, which is a worrying sign. And then Simon swung the beam around to one of the houses, searching it. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Thought I saw someone there. Look." In the beam was a man standing, waving at us, pointing at the roof. We navigated over and climbed onto the roof, but the man was nowhere to be seen, which was again a worrying sign. Below us, we heard someone crying and hammering. We tore the roofing off, and inside, we found an old 89-year-old woman, water up to her chin, standing on a chair. We got her out and into the boat. I looked around and asked her about the man, but she looked at me, bemusedly. "What man?" Simon told her that we saw a man wearing a plaid shirt which looked outdated, and pants, but no raincoat. She frowned and then smiled sadly. "That'll be my Andrew." "Is he around?" I asked, ready to get out. "Oh no," she shook her head. "Andrew's dead. He died in the 74 flood. He was my disabled son. He drowned while trying to get off the roof. Looks like he was looking after his mum, eh?" Simon and I looked at each other, but said nothing. We brought her back, but told our commander the story. She looked at us and said, "At least the old woman is safe." That night, we went back out and saved a further 20 lives. But the man on the roof will always stay in my memory.
Two years ago, June 2018, my mother had passed after I moved back to my hometown. It was a sudden death, and there is a lot my family and I question. It was ruled a suicide, but my family and I believe her boyfriend may have had something to do with her passing. I can explain more, but this is Wholesome Paranormal, so I will tell you the Wholesome Paranormal story. When I first arrived to the town, where my mother was soon to be buried, I had assumed duties of taking care of my 15-year-old sister. My mother's best friend had also arrived around the same time as myself. She took care of us the whole week leading up to the funeral, and the whole week after my mother was buried. All three of us became very close. A day leading up to the funeral is when I started to notice some interesting phenomena happen. The night before the funeral, my mother's boyfriend had showed up to the wake. It was late, I want to say around 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. My sister had noticed him walk into the building while I was visiting with family. She immediately came to me and asked, "What is he doing here?" At first, I had no idea who she was referring to. I panned the room, and I noticed him making his way to my mother's coffin. I beelined straight to him. Thinking about it now, I was way too nice, but I told him, "You are not welcome here. You best get out of here before my uncle sees you." He ended up getting thrown out of the building by my cousin. I was so unbelievably shocked by what had happened and the fact that he had the audacity to show up. My sister and I were so angry. We cried and expressed how angry we were that he showed up. Later that night, we left the building and went to my mother's to sleep, so we could get a good night's rest before the funeral. That night, the town was hit by a huge storm plus the surrounding area. The next day, there were talks of there being a tornado that night, but others say it was a severe thunderstorm. The whole town plus surrounding area had no power. A part of me believes it was my mother. The reason I say this is, there was a tornado that hit my mother's boyfriend's farm. Almost as if my mother knew he had upset my sister, myself, and my family that night. Now I know weather is strange and anything can happen. However, more phenomena continued to happen throughout the day. The funeral was supposed to happen. The morning after the storm, I woke up to a tree that had fallen in the driveway. Not only did this happen in my mother's driveway, but it also happened to all my aunts. I have 6. They were supposed to get to the building where the funeral was being held early at 5 a.m. to start cooking for the funeral. The day leading up to the funeral, I felt as though my family and I were not ready to say goodbye to my mother. After this storm happened, we were unable to have the funeral because the power was out from 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. We ended up having to postpone the funeral one day. The day of the funeral, things seemed to be going fine. Some of my friends from high school had shown up, and one friend, we will call her Allie. Allie had shown up just before the funeral started. She sat a few rows behind me. She had joined me once all the friends and relatives were saying their final goodbyes. My mother's immediate family said their final goodbyes last. Allie was standing next to me when my mother's siblings were saying their goodbyes. When Allie looked at me and said, "Your mum said look for her in the butterflies." She had said it quickly and fast. I looked at her quizzically and said, "What did you just say?" Allie looked me in the eyes and said, "Your mother wanted me to tell you to look for her in the butterflies." I couldn't believe what she told me. All I could do was cry. It was now my sisters and I's turn to say our final goodbye. We were the last ones to say goodbye. My sister and I went up to the coffin, said our goodbyes, and closed the casket together. We both turned around and walked away. At first, I thought my sister was right beside me. I felt someone grab my shoulder, almost as though they were trying to comfort me. Initially, I thought it was my sister, until I turned around and saw no one beside or behind me. I was a little confused at first, but I think it was my mother telling me everything will be okay. When we all went to the cemetery, there were a few monarchs flying around. One of them flew around my sister and I for a while and landed in a tree next to us. I felt like it was looking over the burial of my mother. It was watching over my sister and I. This is my first time doing this. I'm sorry it was so long. I think about this often and wonder if all the things happened was my mother communicating with us. I like to think the storm was her sticking up for herself and our family. I also like to think all the things I experienced afterwards was my mother letting us know she is okay. and it will be okay, even after we say goodbye.
I had a less than 1-year-old fluffy orange kitten who I grew extremely attached to. While he was alive, he was battling an unknown illness. The ER vet thinks it may have been FIP. When he died, I was heartbroken. My dad helped me bury him in my backyard, and I ordered a little granite headstone for him that had his picture etched into it. My aunt lives with me, and when I showed her the headstone I ordered, we were both standing in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, we both heard a meow. It wasn't my other cat because he was asleep in another room, and the meow came from the kitchen. My aunt and I were both sure of that. It freaked both of us out a little that we suddenly heard a meow from nowhere as I was showing her the headstone. My hope is that it was my kitten's spirit, sensing that the headstone was for him, and meowing in approval.
I was a year 2 nursing student from College East in 2006. I was attached to SGH for my IA as it was part of my module to pass my course. It happened in Block 4, Level 3. I was attached to the ward there. Those who are nurses should know where I'm talking about. I have to spend 2 months there in that ward as I was in my 3 week and I was serving a patient. His kidney was on a 2nd stage of renal failure, so which means that he is not too far from 3rd stage, which will cause him to die. As I spent a week serving him, I got to know about his family and his life. He was quite a friendly uncle, which often helped him pass my time faster through my shifts in my attachment, so I kinda spend more time with him talking than the other patients. After spending a good 2 weeks serving him, he has really become a friend. Then, on a Friday afternoon, when it was the end of my shift, I bid my farewell to him and that I'll see him on Monday as a healthier man. Monday came and I came in as usual. It was 7:15 a.m. and I was alone sitting at the counter waiting for the change of shift. I saw my favorite uncle walking to pass the counter to the toilet. I called out to him saying, "Hey, uncle, you can walk already. That's good, that's good. Slowly walk, okay? Or you want me to help you?" He replied calmly, "It's okay, boy. I'm good. You've been a great help already. You got work to do, right? Go. Then he continued to walk on. As he turned into the corner before to enter the gents, he turned around and said, "Really, boy, thank you so much." As a nurse, you get these things kind of a lot, so I just went on doing my stuff. And as the shift changed and the passing of reports came, the report of my uncle was not mentioned in the daily report, so I questioned about his status. All the staff nurses were confused. "Why are you asking about him?" Then I said that I just saw him walking to the toilet just now. All the staff were shocked. Then one of the senior staff pulled me aside to ask me to stop talking. Then she told me that he had died yesterday due to a sudden worse renal failure, which the doctors couldn't save. I did not believe it at first. I ran to check his former bed, and none of his stuff were there. Then I ran to check the toilet, and no one was inside at all. I couldn't believe it, but after a while, I accepted his death, and I went to read his case notes. He was pronounced dead the same time as I saw him on that very day, 7:15 a.m.
My best friend passed away in 2014. I was in school at the time, so I was distraught and didn't know how I would carry on living. To this day, even being married with kids, I still feel like my life is just an epilogue, like my life was paused that day when I found out he died. Fair to say, I was gutted. Anyway, I got really into my PC gaming and would play Counter-Strike with my other friends that I met in college. And it's funny because thinking back on it, I never felt alone, even when it was just me, when my friends were busy all day. One night, I dreamt about him. He met me at the Spear Pillar, a location from a Pokemon game we both loved, and he hugged me, and it was as if it was his younger self had matured, while being 2 to 3 years on the other side. I felt a stubble against my cheek. It was surreal. Further on, he told me that I needed to stop worrying about him and that he was always there with me, be it on the bus, chilling at home, or at college. He said he was always there. Then he said something that quite frankly blew my mind. He mentioned how it's so nice of me to keep the spot at the end of the bed clear for him to sit down on, as it's his favorite spot every night. He loves to watch me play CSGO, especially with my mates. The conversation made me laugh. He said no matter where I am, he'll always find me and keep me company. It's crazy because subconsciously, I would always clear my bed, bearing in mind my room isn't always the tidiest, but as an adult I've gotten better. So I'm glad to have met him, and even when I'm away on deployment or putting my kids to bed, I still feel him around that it makes me happy and nostalgic. In 2017, I got a tattoo dedicated to him. It was my very first. I just miss my friend.
This year, I'm celebrating my 30th birthday. It's gonna be the first time since birth I'm not celebrating this moment with the brave lady who raised me, along with my grandfather. My grandmother died after years and years of suffering. It's a relief, but damn, it hurts. A few hours before her death, the last day I saw her, I slept a few hours to recover from this terrible night as she asked mercy. In this dream, I saw her dead, laying on the bed. Her husband held her and cried. I immediately sent a message to my companion to tell him about the disturbing picture I've seen a few times, since the idea of losing her caused me huge anxiety issues. Then, right after this nightmare, I learned about her. She passed away as I was peacefully sleeping in my bed. It's been a month she's gone now, and I know it's strange, but I totally stopped dreaming about her. This morning, I just woke up in my family's house. I heard the distinct voice saying, "Hi." It was nice and sweet. I responded, "Yes." As my grandfather, who sleeps in his room next to mine, answered, "Yeah?" I asked him if he was calling me and said no. I used to work in a funeral home for years as a counselor. I know grief may lead to hallucinations. Have you ever had a dream about your loved ones who eventually died moments ago? Do you think it's pure coincidence, a simple sign of empathy since I felt extremely worried about her? Do you think I, myself, talked while I was asleep? I know a lot of my friends confirmed I'm a sleep talker. Anyway, that's not the most thrilling experience I witnessed, but I'm curious about these two moments. First, the dream. Secondly, the call. I respect your beliefs. I'm open-minded. Feel free to share. Take care.
The other night, I was heading home and I saw a woman who looked a little worse for wear, like she had a few too many on board. She was getting harassed by some guy, so I went over to see if she was alright, and to help her out. To cut a long story short, she grabbed my shirt as she was falling, and I think she gripped the pocket of my shirt or something, because it ripped and tore a seam in the shirt. I was really annoyed and upset, to be honest. It was my favorite shirt. It was the last birthday present I ever got from my wife, before she passed away, and so it genuinely upset me. but I guess there are other ways to ruin a shirt. At least I was trying to help someone and I didn't spill something on it or rip it through my own clumsiness. Still, it was a shame, but it couldn't be helped. So anyway, I decided to hang on to that shirt. Or maybe I should say I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I figured I could still use it just as long as I didn't wear it outside of the house. So I washed the shirt and I hung it up in the wardrobe. That night, I had a dream. It was the first dream I had in a very long time. I dreamt that I came home just as I did that night, but the only difference was I didn't come home to an empty home. I walked through the door and I saw my wife stood in the hallway, and she was looking right at me. She looked at my shirt and tutted and said, "What's that?" She told me to give it to her, so I took it off and she instantly went to work on it at the dining room table with a needle and a thread. I went upstairs to go and change into another shirt, and I came back down and sat at the sofa. I was looking over at her as she was working on sewing up my shirt, and that's all I remember. It was a nice dream. The next day, I had plans with my daughter to go to the cinema to watch a movie and catch up. She's been living alone for quite some time. I was wondering what to wear. I opened my wardrobe as usual, and I noticed my favorite shirt. I took a look at it again to see how bad the rip was, and to my surprise, I couldn't find it. I turned it over again and again in my hands, and I still couldn't find any tear. I couldn't believe it. I looked at the back of the shirt, and I noticed something. It was sewn up from the back so that the rip wasn't visible at the front. I wondered how the hell that this was possible, and then I remembered my dream from last night. I thought to myself, no way, she stitched it up for me? I just didn't know how to comprehend the situation. It was so strange, but I guess I knew what I was supposed to be wearing. So I took the shirt out of the wardrobe and I threw it on. I told my daughter about my dream and the shirt. She looked at me and said, "Oh, Dad, knowing you were probably drunk and imagined it all. I bet there was no rip in the shirt." As she said this, I could see tears welling in her eyes. I knew what she truly believed about my dream, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. I was amazed. That's really the only word for it. I mean, I got to see my wife again, and my shirt was fixed. I'm still kind of speechless. That's just like her, you know, always helping me out in situations like that. I am hoping that this could be a regular thing. I tell you what, I would love to come home one day and have some of her cooking waiting for me again. Or I'd love to see it in the fridge.
So this story has about 3 different accounts, so you're in for a ride. For some background information, my grandma had a twin sister that died from complications of HIV, which she contracted from an unfaithful husband. She died 16 years before I was born, in her late 50s. This is all going to make sense later. The first time I saw her was when I was 5. I was living in a little town in Massachusetts, about 60 miles off from Boston. My mother was a single mom, businesswoman at the time, so she had an overnight trip to Boston and left my oldest sister Tiny in charge. No, her real name isn't Tiny. It's just what we call her, and it's pronounced Deanie. We'll fast forward to bedtime, and me and my 5 other siblings are all tucked in, ready for bed. I'm going to assume it was around 9 o'clock. I woke up in the middle of the night from a really bad nightmare, which is still reoccurring to this day. Long story short, it's a dream where I'm taken underwater. A dark, almost pitch black hand that's very demon-like is holding me under until I eventually die, I guess. So as any 5-year-old would, I ran to my mother's room for comfort, not remembering my mother was out of town. Well, to my surprise, there was a lady sitting on my mother's bed, looking at the family album. Usually I would have been confused, but the second I walked into the room, I didn't feel so scared anymore. It felt like I'd walked into a warm hug. But she wasn't even near me. The lady was red-headed and beautiful in a kind of old way. The kind of way where you could just tell that they were popular in high school. The lady saw me in distress, got up from the bed, and picked me up, laid me on my mother's bed. Then she started singing in Spanish, a lullaby I'd never heard of, yet I knew every word to it. By the time I knew it, I was sound asleep. My little brother walked into the room and saw the lady crooning over me, caressing my cheek while I slept. I don't know what possessed him to not care and go back to bed, but he noped out of there fast. Well, when my mom finally came home, it was about 7 a.m., and she was tired. She saw me in her bed and was surprised. She woke me up and asked me why I wasn't in my bed, and I told her the nice lady let me stay here. She asked me, "What lady?" And I said I don't know her name, but she has red hair, and she sang me a song, and she was really beautiful. She then looked to her right and saw her album open. Please note, she keeps it on her bedside table, but it was already randomly open to this picture. She looked at the picture and let out a really relieved sigh. She turned around and showed me a picture of the same woman that I saw, asked me if it was her. I said yeah, and I asked her, "Who is she?" She said that it was my guardian angel, and I just took that and said, "Okay, I'm 5. I didn't care." Now fast forward to when I'm 11. It was my first day of school, and the first time my mother allowed me to walk to the bus stop alone. Well, I got hit by a car, but it wasn't my fault. It was a residential area that had a speed limit of like 15 miles per hour. He was going well over that, and I was really small, so he didn't see me. From the accident, I got 3 broken ribs, a broken wrist, broken legs, fractured, and a bad concussion because my head was split. I don't remember it, but next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital to my mom crying, saying she's sorry and that she's happy I'm okay. I had to stay in the hospital for a week for observation because my broken rib was so close to puncturing my lungs. My mom worked a lot, and she had nobody else to watch me, so I spent my nights alone. I got lonely and scared and just had a really bad feeling. So you guessed it, Miss Ma'am came back. I woke up in the middle of the night to her at the edge of my hospital bed, looking at me. At first I was scared. I didn't recognize who the hell she was. But then this warm feeling came back, and I realized I wasn't lonely or worried anymore. Then she hummed that song, and I swear to God, I didn't know the lyrics. I barely speak Spanish. But it's like my soul knew, and before I knew it, I was fluently singing it with her in Spanish until I fell asleep. Now this third time, I didn't see her, but it was more like she let me know that she was there. When I was 18, I got married to a boy I thought I loved, and he went to the military. Long story short, he was abusive. He cheated, lied, put his hands on me, and broke me. Not solely because of my marriage, but definitely a big reason. I fell into a really deep depression and had self-harm habits. One night, it all got too much, and I don't know what he said to send me over the edge, but I was in the bathroom looking at a bottle of Oxy, and I started to take a few just to kind of drown out the heavy feeling. After a few minutes, when I took another, then another, eventually, I started to feel that very thin line between an overdose and lucidity. Then, that feeling happened again, and the song started playing in my head, like if I had a radio in there. And I felt okay. I felt like someone was there for me. In a way, I feel like it was a sign that I wasn't meant to go just yet. And with that, I left him a few months later, and I've never looked back. I haven't seen her since. Around the same time, I finally asked my mother about it, and eventually everything started to make some sense. She told me about my grand aunt and how she passed, and that when she was younger, she was a motherly figure to her because her own mother wasn't a very fit parent. She'd often have to seek comfort from her, and when I was about 5, I looked like a literal carbon copy of my mother. She theorized that maybe her spirit saw me upset and, thinking I'm my mother, wanted to console me. And get this, my mother, when recounting her aunt, was very emotional. So she started talking about some nursery rhyme that she used to sing her. It was the song. My mother sang it word for word in front of me. That's what cemented her story to me as fact. I'm 22 now, and I'm in one of the most loving and healthy relationships I've ever dealt with. I've been sober for 4 years, and I have a much more healthy state of mind now, in case you were wondering. I know this story was long, but I hope if you take anything from my experience, it's that it gets better. You just have to stick around long enough for life to do its magic.
When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. We knew her cancer was terminal, and she had a life expectancy of 5 years at most. Her and I would talk every now and again about passing on, and how even though I was healthy, I could always go before her in a car crash or some other way. We made a pact that no matter which one of us left first, we would come back to the other and let them know that there was more to life after death. She eventually passed away from her illness at 22 years old, leaving behind her husband and 3-year-old son. She passed away on a Sunday at 8:20 a.m. And I remember the call from her husband vividly. He asked me to bring her son to the hospital because she had passed away. The day was a complete blur. I couldn't find myself to come to the reality that she was no longer with us. It all felt unreal. We were allowed to be with her for a few hours in her hospital room before she was taken away. While we were with her, I don't know. I was just in complete shock and my mind just couldn't process it. I didn't even cry. Leaving the hospital was even more strange, because at the time, I had no children. And my life completely revolves around my work, my home, and her. She lived a few minutes from my job at the time, so I would always leave work very early to see her, whether she was at home or the hospital. I loved her so much. I could never be away from her. So now, knowing I had to go home and try to process that I would never see her again just threw my life for a spin. At night I couldn't sleep. I just kept trying to make sense of it all. And in all honesty, I don't even remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but the feelings of loss and confusion were very prevalent to me. I couldn't sleep at all, but at around 3 a.m, I felt the most beautiful and reassuring feeling I've ever felt. I felt what I can only describe as a warm hug take over me from head to toe, and I fell asleep. That night I had a dream. In my dream, I called her husband to let him know that she had written me a letter. He then tells me that it's funny because she left him a voicemail. He then asked me to read him the letter, so I read it to him. In this letter, she tells us how thankful she is that we were in her life. She thanked us for taking care of her and loving her. She asked us to please watch over her son, and she is okay, and no longer in pain. She also tells us that we will all be okay. As I finished telling him about the letter, my mom comes into my room and woke me up. She asked me for a pen and paper. I hand her a piece of paper I had, and she starts to write. When she finishes, she hands it to me, saying she didn't know why, but something told her to write this and then give it to me. When I read the letter, it was word for word what my best friend had told me in my dream, and she signed it with her father's last name. Now, my mom only knew her by her mother's last name. No one outside her close relatives and myself knew her father's last name, so I was very confused as to how she signed it with her father's last name. I asked her why or how she wrote this. My mom didn't know. She just wrote. I explained to her about my dream, and she was just as surprised as I was. I immediately called her husband and told him about the letter and my dream. He agreed they were all her words. My best friend came through with her promise. This made me a believer. I know there's more after death.
I was pregnant with my second child in 1997. My husband and I had our first baby 4 years prior, but always wanted to expand our family. I didn't really envision having a larger family. However, it was my husband's dream to be a dad to many kids. In June of 1997, my husband, Jack, passed away on his way home from work when a truck ran a red light just a few miles away from our house. To any of you who have lost a spouse, I don't have to explain the torment your emotions and body go through afterwards. I spent several months only leaving the house to go to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping. Unexpectedly, I found myself in another relationship in July of the following year. He has since become my husband and cares for my 2 girls like they were his own. He loves to hear stories of my deceased husband. He supports me when he knows I'm feeling down about Jack. My second daughter spent the first 6 months of her life being a very fussy baby. She rarely slept through the night, which meant that I spent the majority of my nights sleeping in a rocking chair in the nursery. She eventually grew out of this phase and would sleep from 8 p.m. until 7 a.m. each day. During this time, my now husband would also tend to her when she would wake up in the morning, just to give me a little more sleep. This phase, unfortunately, didn't last very long. She started becoming fussy throughout the night again. We would both take shifts to lessen the load on each of us. The following incident has only ever happened once. I still don't have any explanation for it. My daughter was crying for hours on end. I was rocking her back and forth, which usually did the trick. Nothing. I must have spent 2 or 3 straight hours in the nursery trying to calm her down, just to the point where I could make my way back to bed. I kept whispering to her, "Please sleep, sweetie. Mom is very tired." After another 15 or 20 minutes, she eventually calmed down, and I laid her in her crib and made my way back to bed. My husband was sitting upright in bed and waiting to see if he needed to go take over. She seemed silent at this point, so we just sat up and talked about if she maybe started teething or wasn't feeling good. She started crying again over the monitor. Occasionally, she will cry for 5 or 10 seconds and then fall back to sleep. I told my husband to wait a moment just to see if this would happen. She continued for another few minutes. We silently listened to the baby monitor in hopes that she'd calm herself down. The silence was broken when we heard what neither one of us are able to describe. "Please go to sleep. Your mom is very tired." Both of us looked at each other with pale expressions on our face. I was frozen to the bed. I swear, that was the voice of Jack. It took us a few moments to go into the nursery. We didn't find anyone. The room was completely empty, aside from my sleeping daughter. I didn't ever believe in the paranormal before. However, this is something that I don't think I'll ever be able to explain.
This isn't my story, but one that I heard from a member of my caving club. The story is a bit distressing, but I think that it serves a purpose, so please, hear me out. In Iwate Prefecture, there are numerous caves. Back when this story takes place, it wasn't as touristy as it is today, so Many of the caves lay unmapped and partially unexplored because internal surveys weren't often conducted. Back then, survey events were held within the caving community, and this story concerns a very large cave survey on a winter's day. Participants broke up into groups, with the more experienced members of the club trying to map and investigate the cave. There were areas which had already been mapped, and some of the caving club members grew a bit bored of measuring areas of the cave. They were more interested in taking photos and looking for wildlife. This was not a good idea. This is why I guess we're told this cautionary tale when we joined the club. One of the cave explorers decided to crawl down a narrow opening in the cave. The others in the club knew, based on the survey, that there was nothing but a dead end. So, initially they weren't concerned. Unfortunately, that changed quickly. We knew that he would go in, find nothing, and probably squirm his way back out backwards, since it was incredibly narrow. But after a few minutes passed, he didn't come back. We all gathered around and began to panic. We looked at the tiny crevice that he managed to crawl through, and then someone in the club asked aloud, "Is there enough room to turn around in there?" Another chimed in with what we were all thinking. Did he get stuck? And there was a sober silence which was broken by the sound of someone shuffling. He came back out of the crevice. I can't tell you how relieved I was to see him. Something was wrong, though. He looked jaded and frightened. Not only that, he didn't come back out backwards. He came out facing everyone. It seemed impossible. Then he began to mumble about what had just happened in the narrow crevice. I got to a dead end, but there was something more. There was an even narrower hole. For some reason, I poked at it and discovered that the earth beneath the hole could be moved aside. After working at this for a while, I managed to get the hole wide enough to fit both of my arms through, then my whole body. It opened up into a reasonably wide chamber. That's how he was able to turn around. He went on, "I thought I had found an undiscovered part of the cave, and I was really excited. I shone my torch all over the cave, and my torchlight fell on something. A doll, or maybe a mannequin, was lying on the cave floor. I had heard of seeing things in caves, stalagmites which appear to look human, as well as odd formations of mud on the cave floor. I was aware that my eyes could play tricks on me in the dark too, but none of this accounted for the fact that the human-shaped mass was wearing glasses." "So, you think it was human?" He nodded his head silently. The caving club left and called the police. Later, the body was identified. According to the police, it was the body of a high school student who had went missing a few years ago. He entered the cave with candles and some sweets, so we can establish that he had intent to explore the cave. But for what purpose? Some speculate it was because he wanted to commit suicide. Others say he must have just wanted to explore. Perhaps it was his own little secret base. Due to this portion of the cave being almost completely shut off, his body had been preserved from the elements. The only issue was that muddy water from above had dripped onto the body. One strange thing was, the glasses did not have a drop of muddy water on them. If you've never been in a cave with no source of light, perhaps I can help you imagine what it's like. I've been in caves where I have turned the torch off just for a second. It was so dark that I couldn't tell whether my eyes were open or shut. I tried to stay in the dark as long as possible. The longest I could manage was about a minute. But I think that the everyday ordinary person could keep their sense of balance for about 10 minutes. After that, you wouldn't know up from down. Then, the mind wanders. The things in the dark, they can tolerate it, but man can't. The sounds, the loss of direction, it all adds up. It all takes a toll. The poor high school boy could have lasted 30 minutes or so without panic in there. I'm assuming that there was some sort of cave-in which buried the only exit. things would have gotten worse when his matches got wet, or perhaps he couldn't find where he put the candles. At this point, he would have regretted his decision to enter the cave, as there would be no one around to hear his whimpers or screams for help. He would be cursing himself time and time again for coming or not bringing a torch, maybe even wishing he had told someone where he was going. How many times did he trace his hands along the walls looking for that exit? Back and forth, back and forth. How many days did he live? What kind of hallucinations did he see? Unsure if he was awake or asleep, hallucinating or thinking straight, hunger or thirst. One of those would have come for him towards the end, but not before his mind tormented him further. Maybe he didn't even truly feel like himself towards the end. Maybe his identity faded into the darkness. How many times did he scream? Scratch the walls? Cry? He would have died without even realizing he was alive or dead, staring back into the corner, hiding from whatever was tormenting him, his glasses resting on his nose, pointing towards the exit he could no longer find. I think this is the most terrifying and tragic death that I've ever heard. Please, do not explore caves alone or without equipment. Tell people where you are going, and above all, stay safe.
This happened last June, and back in those days, I was a motorcyclist. I bought my bike after I graduated, and I used to ride it at every chance I got. I didn't even have a direction in mind. I just loved riding. I was riding one evening, and I knew that I had a day off on the following day, so I felt like going kind of far. I had a good night out riding, and I decided to head home sometime after midnight. I was on my way back towards Setagaya in Tokyo. The roads were not so busy. I was taking it easy, and as if all of a sudden the car in front stopped. It stopped at such a speed that it collided with the guardrail. I was shocked to see an accident happen right before my eyes. I had no other choice but to pull over and try to figure out what happened. I raced over to the driver's side window and I saw that the driver was female. She was visibly distressed. She couldn't stop shaking her head and her hands were firmly clamped on the steering wheel. Oh, this is bad, I thought to myself. I started off by asking if she was all right, in as gentle of a tone as I could muster. I waited a few seconds, but she didn't reply to my question. I started to panic. This was serious. I realized that I should call the police, so I did. While waiting for the police, I asked several times if the woman was all right, and eventually she got out of the car. She didn't look hurt, but her skin had gone very pale, almost to the point it looked blue. She was muttering something. I couldn't make out what she was saying, so I leaned my ear close to her mouth. She kept murmuring, "What have I done?" I could hear the tremble in her voice, and then, as if in answer to her own question, she said something. "I've run over a child." She kept repeating these words. Her voice gathered strength and volume, and it was very hard to listen to her panicked wails. I was deeply disturbed. It was a frightening situation. Then I remembered that I was behind her, and I didn't see a child in the road. I was certain that there was no one around, plus it was the dead of night. I looked back and I couldn't see a child anywhere. I sat with that woman and tried to calm her down for a while, but occasionally I stood up and went in search of the child she thought she'd hit with her car. There were no children in the area. A few moments later, the police arrived. I spoke with one of the officers and he searched with me for this child. The officer asked me about what happened repeatedly, and I repeatedly told him that all I saw was the lady in front swerve and hit the guardrail. I said that I didn't see anyone on the road. The officer went and asked the woman about what had happened, and I went with him to listen. According to the woman, she saw a young child dart out into the road ahead of her car, and she heard and felt the collision. But no matter what we did, and no matter where we searched, we couldn't find the child. The officer started back towards his patrol car while talking into his radio, and the woman was looking around the road absent-mindedly. I watched as her eyes fell on the roadside mirror. You know those mirrors you sometimes see in rural areas that allow you to see oncoming traffic around the bends? They're a circular type, and they're usually on a pole high enough for the driver to see, but not be distracted. I think they're sometimes known as convex mirrors. Well, that's what she looked at. She laid her eyes on it. A terrible scream rose from the pit of her stomach. The officer was as shocked as I was to hear this, and he rushed over to her. He noticed that she was looking at something in the roadside mirror. I came over to look as well. We looked into the mirror and saw a child in the road. There was no one there when we looked without the help of a mirror, but when we looked into the mirror, the child was there. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I couldn't believe my eyes. The child looked to be about 4 or 5 years old. She was wearing a kindergarten uniform. She looked like the kid that went to a good school. That child stared at us with an utterly expressionless look on her face. The police officer and I turned to look at the road almost simultaneously, and there was no child in the road. We looked back at the mirror, and we could only see ourselves and the female driver sat on the side of the road. Our faces looked incredibly pale, and our mouths hung open in shock. The woman then exploded into a full-blown state of panic, and the ambulance that was intended for the child took the woman away, but not before she went and asked me for my contact information, saying she might call to ask me about what had happened. And the officer said that for her sake, it wouldn't be a good idea, and it would be better to forget about the incident entirely. His face as white as snow. I insisted that the officer should take my information, but there was to be no further contact from anyone I met that day. I am sorry, but it has left me very confused and troubled. I think about it often. What really happened that day is a mystery to me, but I believe that I had a run-in with the paranormal, and that little girl's spirit remains in the spot she met her final moments.
This happened in January of 2019. My stepdad had been in our family's life for 30 years before he was diagnosed with cancer. He never had any biological children, but he had me and my sister, and we couldn't have asked for a better stepdad or granddad for our children. I was with him when he was diagnosed and with him for all of his treatments. From the very beginning, there was no question of who would take care of him. It was going to be me. He and my mother were split up at the time, and it just seemed natural that I would be the one to do it because of how close we were. And honestly, I considered it an honor. Unfortunately, his prognosis was not very good, and they gave him less than a year to live. He barely made it 6 months after his diagnosis. He was in the hospital the last 6 days of his life. He had a DNR in place, and as hard as it was, I didn't argue with him about it. 2 days before he passed, he was in and out of consciousness and was barely able to talk. But his last night, he was able to communicate that he really wanted me to go home and check on the dogs. This was just after 3 o'clock in the morning. I told him I would do that, and then I would be right back. He gave me a small smile and nodded. It took 20 minutes for me to get home, and 10 minutes after walking through the door, the hospital called and said he had passed. I felt so guilty for leaving until I thought, he knew there was already someone with the dogs, but he insisted that I check on them. Perhaps he didn't want me there at that time. I don't know. I still don't know. But what I do know is that the morning after he passed, I had a missed call from his phone, which had been in my purse the whole time he was in the hospital. The call was made at 3:47 a.m., and the voicemail that was left said, "Thank you for everything, sweetheart. I love you." That message was left in my stepdad's perfect, loving voice, not the raspy, out-of-breath, strained voice he had moments before he died. Some people have said that it may have just been an old message that I had just received that morning, but either way, I thought it was amazing.
I'm a hiker. I love the mountains. I found this thread, and it seems like a good place to share my experience. During the coldest period of the year, I climbed Mount Daisetsuzan in Hokkaido. It was freezing, one of the coldest winters I've ever experienced. Despite the winter temperature, that day the weather was gorgeous, even from the early morning, the perfect day for climbing. But it was winter, and the weather can change in the blink of an eye up in the mountains. During the afternoon, the clouds in the sky looked dark and worrisome, and in no time at all, an intense snowstorm had started up. It was a bit too late to turn back, and it would have been incredibly dangerous to do so. I knew that if I kept climbing, I would get to a cabin which was built as an emergency shelter. But I was worried that I wouldn't be able to find it due to the whiteout. I didn't even know my position on the mountain. I was prepared to camp out in a bivouac if necessary. You know, like a tent. I have a lot of experience in climbing, hiking and camping, and I came prepared that day. I was prepared, but to be honest, I wasn't looking forward to the prospect of camping in a snowstorm. Just as soon as these thoughts came to mind, the weather turned again. The snowstorm was showing signs of slowing. I could see my way again, and after a short while, I knew where I was. I didn't risk it. I headed straight to the emergency shelter. This took me about 2 hours. I was feeling very anxious and worried, but despite my anxiety, I found the cabin. It was almost entirely covered by snow. The sun was beginning to set. You know how early the sun can set in winter. I didn't want to be out there in the dark. I was so relieved to find the cabin, I have to say. When I went in, I noticed that there was 2 others in there. They were lying down sleeping. I didn't want to wake them up, so I quietly closed the door. I laid out my sleeping bag and got in. I wanted to be warm. After warming up a little, I made a quick dinner with my provisions and then I laid down to sleep. I woke up during the night. I don't know how long I slept for, hours, minutes. I was awakened by some mumbling sound. I guessed that it was the voices of those hikers who were in the cabin with me. I listened carefully, and it sounded like there was a man and a woman speaking. It sounded like they were talking about the trip they were planning tomorrow and the weather. I could hear some muffled laughter at points. I was thinking, why not just save this chat for the morning? Include me too. If we're going the same way, then let's help each other out. While I was thinking about all of that, I fell back into a deep sleep. I woke up the following morning. The atmosphere felt heavy. After a moment or two of being awake, about 10 men came rushing into the cabin. It scared the hell out of me. It was as cold as ice in that cabin. One of the men said to me, "Oh God, are you still alive?" I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I had just woken up and I was confused. Then another one of the men said, "No, it's them over there." He gestured with his chin in the direction of the man and the woman I was sharing the cabin with. I asked what was going on, and I was told that the 2 with me had radioed for rescue, but unfortunately, due to the terrible snowstorm, the rescue helicopter couldn't get up to them. The only choice the rescuers had was to go by foot, and it took 2 days to reach them on the mountain. Sadly, it was too late for the couple. They passed away due to exposure at a higher point in their climb. The rescue men were unable to bring the bodies down the mountain because the weather took another turn, so a decision was made to leave their bodies in the emergency shelter cabin rather than risk a double tragedy. These men were back to transport the bodies down the mountain. I couldn't get my head around it. I couldn't grasp the situation. What about the mumbling voices I heard? What about their conversation about how they were going to get down the mountain? Hallucinations and auditory hallucinations are not uncommon in the harshest of winters, apparently. Is that what this really was? I wasn't convinced. I asked if they were a couple because the way they had been speaking to one another sounded like they were. They confirmed that they were newlywed. This climb was part of their honeymoon. Furthermore, the male was apparently known to this mountain rescue team. He was a prolific climber. I was advised to leave the mountain range before the weather took another turn. I took that advice. I made it safely down the mountain, and I had a long time to think about the experience I had. I still think about it often. When I heard that I had spent the night with 2 fresh bodies, I was at first creeped out, especially since I had heard them talk to one another. I thought about the voices I heard. They were cheerful and not frightening. Like I said, they even laughed with one another at points. That kind of warms my heart. The mountains are wonderful places. I heard them say they were planning on leaving the mountain in the morning, and I really hope they did. I hope that they're at rest. If I pass on in the mountains, I'd like to think I'd be alright with that. Thinking about my experience in this way makes me feel better about the whole thing.
I don't really know if this belongs here. And this is really the only experience I had that I couldn't really explain. About a week and a half ago, my grandfather on my dad's side of the family finally passed. He had already passed away a long time ago. Sometime when I was in middle school, he became a hollow man with the lights on, but no one home. When he was there, he loved his grandchildren and loved bonding with us, especially me. I was the more sporty one, and we connected with that, and bonded. The night he passed, I woke up in the middle of the night with a warm, fuzzy, familiar feeling. I didn't feel alone. The room was filled with his scent, and I started to tear up. I didn't think him passing would make me cry, because I already did when I realized he no longer knew who I was. But this feeling made me cry. The smell, the familiar warm feeling. It was really weird. I told my dad about it, and he started tearing up and said, "Yeah, buddy, he definitely visited you before leaving our world. I bet he visited all his family before seeing the rest. I am still iffy on paranormal things, and I'm trying to think of anything it could have been, but I'm blank. I really think he came to say the goodbye he never was able to say. I love you so much, Papa Jeff."
I want to tell you a couple of stories about when I used to live on the streets as a homeless man. It was hell living on the streets. The stares and the looks of disgust were nothing compared to the violence I endured. I got into an altercation with some guys one night in a park in Tokyo, and I was beaten within an inch of my life. I had to get out of the area as I thought they would be back. I remember moving from place to place, and it was all a bit of a blur. Somehow, I ended up way up in the sticks, close to the mountains, and eventually, I ended up living in an abandoned shrine. It wasn't so bad. I would walk down to the village and exchange my labor for food in the village. You might think that living in an abandoned shrine might be scary, but I can tell you that there was only one thing I was scared of at the time: people. I would offer my services to anyone who had work available. I like to think of myself as a jack of all trades, an all-rounder. I would often go to ask people on the street or go door to door trying to drum up some work. Once, a guy asked me what services I could offer. "Pretty much anything," I said. He then pulled a gun out, cocked the trigger, and put it against my head. "It's loaded," he said. You can imagine how I felt. He put the gun away and said, "I just wanted to point a loaded gun at a human." Then he threw some money my way and left. I guess that the cash he threw was what he deemed the value of my life to be. Not long after that, a gang found out where I had been living. They came late one night. When they found me, one said a phrase so off-putting, I don't think I will ever forget it. "You have no human rights." He had already dehumanized me. They carried sticks, iron bars, and metal pipes and came at me. It was too late to escape, and when they were through, I was left with a broken leg. It was hell. At the same time, I experienced such a lack of humanity. I also experienced the opposite. The farmer I had worked for in the village brought food to me when he had heard about the gang attack, and even paid for my hospital bills. If it wasn't for him, I probably wouldn't have been found, and I might have starved to death in my makeshift home. There was no way I could have got down the mountain to the village with a broken leg. I owed that man my life. I asked if there was a way that I could repay him, and he just replied, "Ah, hell, why don't you try and grow some vegetables or something? Make yourself a living. Pay me back something when you get set up, and there's no rush." I learned a lot about agricultural work from him. Even when he gave me a method to repay his generosity, I felt like I was still getting more than I was giving. The soil by the shrine was hard, and nothing much would grow, but I was determined to pay him back. I would go to the river countless times a day to fetch water. Eventually, I made some serious progress. This joy was short-lived. A group of people who were into urban exploration came to the abandoned shrine and trashed my little farm. They stomped over all my plants. Why? I had nothing, yet people still wanted to take from me. Something snapped in me. I felt robbed, and I wanted someone to pay for it. I kept a 2x4 with me at all times. I decided to be ready for whoever wanted to mess with me. Living that way made me happy. Fight or flight, a return to animal instincts. I knew that all humans were capable of terrible acts. I grew less trustworthy. I was always scared of spirits and ghosts, but humans are worse. It was at this point I started seeing things. I thought the shrine was haunted. I decided if there was something else with me in the shrine, I wanted to be of service to the shrine, since the farm wasn't working out. I had learned some carpentry skills when I was younger. I thought I would try to clean up the place and mend some things. Maybe if the shrine looked a bit more maintained, it would keep the urban explorers and the gangs away. Being busy took my mind off my hate for those who sought to hurt me. I started to speak to God, or whatever the spirits that inhabited the shrine were. I would say hello and goodbye, at first to myself, and then quietly, but in the end, I was talking loudly like there was someone with me. Eventually, the shrine looked pretty good. I started to see the ghost again. She was a beautiful woman, and she was so pleased that I had cleaned up the shrine. She would just sit there and comb her gorgeous hair. Sometimes I wouldn't even see her, I would just hear some rummaging noises. I felt that I had some company, and I enjoyed it. The gang came back one night, the same gang which attacked me and broke my leg. They laughed at me when I called for help, when I called to her. But they weren't laughing when my friend who owned the farm arrived with his hunting rifle. They never came back after that. Since he saved me, I decided to stop being so hateful, and I put that energy in agriculture. I still needed to pay him back, even though he wasn't expecting anything from me. I was determined, and through years of hard work, dedication, and support from my friend, I managed to hone my skills. I found some land to rent, used it, did well, and kept repeating. Now I own several plots, and I have several employees. I usually offer work to those who are in the same position as me, the homeless. And as for my friend, I paid him back. I bought him several plots of land by the mountains. Finding a partner hasn't really worked out for me, but whenever I am down, I seem to dream about the spirit of the woman in the shrine. Sometimes I think I was rescued by someone other than my farmer friend. So, my next project is restoring the shrine to its former glory and reinstating a priest there.
This happened a few minutes ago. I had just taken my freshly baked vanilla and cinnamon raisin cakes out of the oven and wanted to snap a photo of them to send to my best friend and my aunt. My camera had the AI option activated because I forgot to disable it after my outing on Friday night. As I turned my camera towards the kitchen table, the AI frame showed a food sign since I snapped a picture of the cakes, and when facing the kitchen table and kitchen door, it showed a person sign. The person sign appears when the AI feature detects a person's presence. The thing is, I was alone. My parents were napping, and my sister was in her room studying. My aunt was working at her boyfriend's family farm, trying to finish before sundown and before the rain moved in. The house is my mom and aunt's childhood home. My grandmother lived in it from 1983 to 2017. She died in her sleep in her room, which is now my parents' current bedroom. All of us have experienced something that might be considered to be a presence. We'd feel a hand on our backs, shoulders, or heads, as I have mentioned before in other posts, but never captured anything on a camera or radio. Although my computer turns on by itself in the middle of the night, or during the day when it's in sleep mode, I don't think that has anything to do with a ghost. I found it odd because I didn't feel a presence, but the person sign remained on for a moment when I placed the camera in the same spot again. A second after I realized what had happened, it showed nothing. If there's a ghost after all, I think it's either my grandma or my grandpa, or both of them keeping an eye on us. Maybe they, she, or he wanted to see how the cakes turned out. I thought to share this because it's nothing spooky. It's something wholesome in my mind, and maybe it'll cheer someone up.
The doorbell rang after 1:30 a.m. The movie The Vikings, with Tony Curtis and Kirk Douglas, was on downstairs, music blaring while my mum was busying herself around. She was a night owl, but this night, she was up until my dad got home. They had fought earlier, and he went out for the night with business associates. She was supposed to accompany them, but refused, so he went alone. I had just returned from looking for him. He had called just before 1 a.m. He thought I was my mum. He asked me to pick him up. I could tell he had been drinking. "Stay where you are, Dad. I'm on my way." At 1:06 a.m., just as I'm walking out the door, he calls again. "I'll be walking and waving my arms," he slurred on repeat. "No, Dad. Stay where you are. I'm leaving now." When I got there, I could not find him. Every time I tried, I was pushed back by the blast of late December air. But there was a car, turned the wrong way on the dark, rural, 2-lane road, with a rumpled up hood and a windshield busted out. Wow, I thought. They must have hit a deer. No cops yet. No ambulance. I got there before they did. I opened our front door shortly after I got home to a police officer and a minister. I'll never forget, till the day I die, the minister. His dark skin, set off by his large, compassionate dark eyes that stared right into me. Afraid for me, reaching out to me, knowing he was about to change my life. The officer asked me if my mum was home. "Yes," I answered. "If this is about my dad, I was just looking for him," I said with a casual, almost friendly tone to hide my apprehension. "We need to speak to your mother," was the officer's curt response. His "just the facts, ma'am" demeanour was more than matched by the compassion the minister gave me by his full-on profound stare. While I was hanging up my coat, I heard the minister tell my mum, "There's been an accident, and your husband was killed." He died at 1:11 a.m. Dad and Mum were 40. I was 19. Home from school. It was just after Christmas. My siblings were younger and all still in school. The rest of the night was a whir of hospital, identify the body visits, the priest, phone calls, drives to the place he died and back again, and sitting around in disbelief. What do we do now? He was the most powerful man in the world. He was gone. We were adrift. It was a long time before I could sleep again. I think it was not until later that next night. People were calling. Small town, so it was the headline on the front page that morning. Pedestrian killed on X road. I know because my boyfriend at the time and I ran out and bought the paper at dawn. Papers. I still have mine. People kept coming over bringing food, crying, needing comfort. The janitor from my former high school was the first person to call with condolences. Dad was very loved. We were numb. Mum was melting. I had to step up. I finally had enough and went to bed. Everyone else remained talking downstairs. Mum was still up. So were siblings, 2 to 4. I decided to go lie down in Mum and Dad's bed, on his side of the bed, and buried my face in his pillow. It smelled like him. Lying flat on my stomach, I silently cried myself to sleep in the darkness. He'd been dead now about 24 hours. How was that possible? At some point, I was awakened by someone sitting on the bed, stroking my hair. It was a real, genuine, sensory touch. Comforting, loving. I felt it from a dead, exhausted sleep state. No mistaking it. So real that when it woke me up, I reached up expecting to touch my mum's hand. Empty space. "Mum?" I said as I rolled over. Silence. "Mum? Is that you?" Electric stillness. I reached out from the bed and waved my arm back and forth in the darkness. Nothing. No one. I sat up. "Mum!" Dead silence. Dead darkness. I got up, ran out of the room and sprang to the top of the stairs. "Mum!" "Yes?" she replied. "Were you just up here in your room, trying to wake me up?" Pin drop. "No, honey," she said softly. "I just felt you rubbing my hair," I implored, almost begging. Pause. "It wasn't me, sweetheart," she said flatly. But it had been so real. It woke me up. I ran all the way down the stairs and just looked at her. We just stared. Tears started to well up in her eyes, then in mine too. We didn't say another word. We didn't have to. I turned away, staring at the floor, and just whispered to myself, "I love you too, Dad." My grandpa, Norm, died when I was 4. I was so young, I only vaguely remember him. But he's obviously still my grandpa, and I still love him. Growing up, I always saw ghosts, and the majority of the time, shadow people. I grew pretty used to it, but sometimes it would still freak me out. Well, one day, when I was probably 9 or 10, I was staying at my grandma's for the weekend. I did this frequently, my grandma borderline raised me. I didn't have a bedtime on weekends, especially there. And my grandma had internet and a computer that I didn't have at home. So I would usually be up till 2 or 3 a.m. on YouTube and whatever 9-year-old me felt like doing. As I've always had insomnia and sleeping issues, and wanted to make the most out of having the internet. So it was probably around 2ish in the morning. I was seeing shadow people that night out of the corner of my eye, messing with me, and it happened to be one of those nights where it freaked me out. And I was very anxious and paranoid. I suddenly had the urge that I needed to look to my left, so I did. In the doorway of my grandma's bedroom, I saw my grandpa Norm. I may have been young when he died, but I do have memories with him and remembered what he looked like, so I knew who he was right away. He just smiled at me and then disappeared. The second I looked over and saw him though, all of my fear vanished and I was instantly calm. The entire energy of the room shifted and I was fine the rest of the night. Naturally, I told my grandma what happened the next morning, and she nearly cried, and still talks about it to this day. I'm going on 20 now. Unrelated to that story, but I think it's worth mentioning. I was talking to my grandma recently, and she told me that one night, somewhere within the span of the past month, she was crying because she missed him, and has been dreaming and thinking of him a lot lately. During this, she said to the empty room, "Norm, if you're up there and watching over me, send me some sort of sign. Rain dimes down so I know." Since that night, she's been finding dimes everywhere she goes. Way more than what would be considered usual. I am in no way religious, but I would say I'm pretty spiritual, and I don't believe in coincidences personally. And that story has stuck with me since she told me. Sorry this ended up much longer than expected. I just thought I'd share one of my nice ghost stories. I had 2 dogs, one being a 100-pound Chow Chow retriever mix. He didn't like to jump. He had a spot on the couch he could crawl up on, but when it came to beds and cars, he always needed a lift up. At night, he would wander around, and when he was finally ready for bed, he would finally walk into my bedroom and plop down on the side with a thump that would shake the bed. In 2012, he developed inoperable cancer, and from then on, he went pretty fast. The day came where it was time to say goodbye. I took him to the vet and put him down and drove home without him. I was very distraught, losing my happy boy. Now, my bedroom door creaks pretty loudly when it opens. I sleep with my door open a crack so my other dog and my cats can come and go through the night. Maybe a week of mourning passes, and I'm up one night. I'm just laying there with my eyes closed, trying to fall asleep, when I hear my door creak slightly. I thought it could have been my other dog and didn't think much of it. I open my eyes and look for her, and find she's not there. Then, the door creaks again. I sit up and watch it. The door opens a little at a time, maybe a couple of inches over a couple of minutes, until it is wide open. I just sit there and stare at it, unable to move, because I couldn't explain what was happening. After it had been open for about 30 seconds, I feel a large thump by the side of my bed that shakes it. The first night I was terrified. I couldn't fall back asleep. The next night it happened again. As soon as it was light out, I got out of bed and began trying to manipulate the door that opened on its own. My window was closed at night, but I opened it. I tried pointing fans at the door. I pushed the door open myself. I opened other windows when it was windy to create a cross draft. I turned all the air in the house on. Nothing I could do could cause my door to move at all. After about a week of this, I'm not scared anymore. I can't explain it, but it even started to be a little comforting. Feeling the thump of my beloved dog laying down next to me, I'll take it. After that week, it just stopped. I laid up at night and waited for it, but it never happened again. 8 years have passed, and my door has never, not once, opened on its own again. When my other dog passed, I waited for it to happen, but it never did. I was, however, up at night again, and I heard her growl like she did when she needed to be let out. Only the once, and then nothing paranormal ever happened again. The doorbell rang after 1:30 a.m. The movie The Vikings, with Tony Curtis and Kirk Douglas, was on downstairs, music blaring while my mum was busying herself around. She was a night owl, but this night, she was up until my dad got home. They had fought earlier, and he went out for the night with business associates. She was supposed to accompany them, but refused, so he went alone. I had just returned from looking for him. He had called just before 1 a.m. He thought I was my mum. He asked me to pick him up. I could tell he had been drinking. "Stay where you are, Dad. I'm on my way." At 1:06 a.m., just as I'm walking out the door, he calls again. "I'll be walking and waving my arms," he slurred on repeat. "No, Dad. Stay where you are. I'm leaving now." When I got there, I could not find him. Every time I tried, I was pushed back by the blast of late December air. But there was a car, turned the wrong way on the dark, rural, 2-lane road, with a rumpled up hood and a windshield busted out. Wow, I thought. They must have hit a deer. No cops yet. No ambulance. I got there before they did. I opened our front door shortly after I got home to a police officer and a minister. I'll never forget, till the day I die, the minister. His dark skin, set off by his large, compassionate dark eyes that stared right into me. Afraid for me, reaching out to me, knowing he was about to change my life. The officer asked me if my mum was home. "Yes," I answered. "If this is about my dad, I was just looking for him," I said with a casual, almost friendly tone to hide my apprehension. "We need to speak to your mother," was the officer's curt response. His "just the facts, ma'am" demeanor was more than matched by the compassion the minister gave me by his full-on profound stare. While I was hanging up my coat, I heard the minister tell my mum, "There's been an accident, and your husband was killed." He died at 1:11 a.m. Dad and Mum were 40. I was 19. Home from school, it was just after Christmas. My siblings were younger and all still in school. The rest of the night was a whir of hospital, identify the body visits, the priest, phone calls, drives to the place he died and back again, and sitting around in disbelief. What do we do now? He was the most powerful man in the world. He was gone. We were adrift. It was a long time before I could sleep again. I think it was not until later that next night. People were calling. Small town, so it was the headline on the front page that morning. Pedestrian killed on X road. I know because my boyfriend at the time and I ran out and bought the paper at dawn. Papers. I still have mine. People kept coming over bringing food, crying, needing comfort. The janitor from my former high school was the first person to call with condolences. Dad was very loved.
We were numb. Mum was melting. I had to step up. I finally had enough and went to bed. Everyone else remained talking downstairs. Mum was still up, so were siblings, 2 to 4. I decided to go lie down in Mum and Dad's bed, on his side of the bed, and buried my face in his pillow. It smelled like him. Lying flat on my stomach, I silently cried myself to sleep in the darkness. He'd been dead now about 24 hours. How was that possible? At some point, I was awakened by someone sitting on the bed, stroking my hair. It was a real, genuine, sensory touch. Comforting, loving. I felt it from a dead, exhausted sleep state. No mistaking it. So real that when it woke me up, I reached up expecting to touch my mum's hand. Empty space. "Mum?" I said as I rolled over. Silence. "Mum? Is that you?" Electric stillness. I reached out from the bed and waved my arm back and forth in the darkness. Nothing. No one. I sat up. "Mum!" Dead silence. Dead darkness. I got up, ran out of the room and sprang to the top of the stairs. "Mum!" "Yes?" she replied. "Were you just up here in your room, trying to wake me up?" Pin drop. "No, honey," she said softly. "I just felt you rubbing my hair," I implored, almost begging. Pause. "It wasn't me, sweetheart," she said flatly. But it had been so real. It woke me up. I ran all the way down the stairs and just looked at her. We just stared. Tears started to well up in her eyes, then in mine too. We didn't say another word. We didn't have to. I turned away, staring at the floor, and just whispered to myself, "I love you too, Dad." This story happened a long, long time ago. When I was 4 years old and my little brother was 2. It was around this time of year, Thanksgiving to be precise. My mother was calling my younger brother to eat from the living room, but he didn't come right away. When he came in, my grandma jokingly asked what took him so long. What he said caused the people at the table to go quiet. "Joe gives kisses." Some info. My great-grandfather was named Joseph, and he went by Joe. He had been dead for 5 years. For ages, people had always chalked it up to being me, as my name was Joseph as well. But my brother always called me by my full name. My brother has mental issues, and that's why nobody batted an eye when he would look up at the living room mantel and laugh. I think it was Grandpa Joe he was talking to. My mum's house is huge, relatively secluded, and century-old farmhouse in Wisconsin. To add to the already spooky vibes, the former residents are buried down the road from the house in a tiny graveyard. I've had more than a few experiences on the property, and my mum has too. This is one of the more wholesome ones though. Specifically, in the kitchen dining room of my mum's house, we'd occasionally spot a black shape moving in the corner of our eye. That had be gone when we looked at it. I don't know how else to describe it, except that even though I've never seen it head on, it has always just suggested the thought of cat to me when I saw it. It was a very neutral but skittish presence. It would also seem to appear mostly as we were mid-conversation or mid-meal. Maybe it wanted a treat or something. As a cat person, I've always felt fond of it. We had both a cat and a dog, but based on size and colour, It couldn't have been either of them. No pest problems at that time either. I've seen it, my mum's seen it, and I think another family member or two has seen it too. The reason I don't remember is because, like most of the other paranormal activity in the house, it stopped happening within 6 months of us moving in. I hope at this point, the ghost cat is somewhere with its former owners, finally getting the snacks and cuddles it deserves. This experience happened in May of 1979 when I was 15 years old. My maternal grandmother had passed, maybe a week or two before this event. I always loved going to her house as a child and spending the night. She was a wonderful grandma. She had moved to California after her last husband died in 1976, so I didn't get to see her for the last 3 years of her life. I was a freshman in high school, and in English class we were reading Romeo and Juliet. I had stayed up late that night while my parents slept to watch Romeo and Juliet on our local PBS station. All 3 of my older brothers had already moved out of the house, so I was the only one awake at that time. I was laying on the floor of the living room with my pillow and blanket, with only the television on. All the lights in the house were off. I'd never really had any odd things happen to me in our home, and was quite comfortable being up alone with no lights. A little explanation on how our house was laid out. The living room was in the front of the house, with the dining room and kitchen directly behind the living room. The area between the living room and the dining room is completely open, while the kitchen area is blocked from the living room by the wall for the stairs going to the basement. You could walk from the living room to the dining room, to the kitchen, to the front hallway, which brings you back to the living room. Between the kitchen and the front hallway is the basement stairs, and if you go the other direction, it's a hallway to the 3 bedrooms and bathroom. On with the story. I was on the floor with pillow and blanket watching the TV when I heard the sound of flip-flop shoes come from the kitchen into the dining room and right up behind my dad's reclining chair. That was maybe 3 feet behind me. Now, my grandma always wore flip-flops in the summer. It was a sound I associated with her. I've always loved the paranormal and accepted it as part of life. My mum had told me things that happened to her as a child and adult since I was little. But when I heard the flip-flops, I was basically frozen in fear. I called out in a small voice, "Mom?" Even though I knew it was not her. No answer. I knew she was sleeping and never wore those type of shoes, or even owned a pair of them. I can't even remember if I was brave enough to look behind the chair. I grabbed up my pillow and blanket, turned off the TV, and ran like a frightened rabbit. I'm not sure how I navigated the first corner. It was completely dark in the house, but when I made the second turn to go into the hallway to the safety of my room, I miscalculated the turn and ran directly into the wall. Luckily, I had my blanket draped over my arm, otherwise I might have broken it. When I hit the wall, all my mind could think was that I ran into a person, most likely the ghost of my grandma. I was struck with crazy terror before I figured out it was just the wall and that I had made the turn too soon. In the safety of my room, lights on, door locked, and under my blanket, I slowly calmed myself down. I don't remember for sure, but I think I slept with the lights on that night. I told my mum the next morning. She asked me why I was so scared, and made me realize that my grandma would never hurt me, and that maybe she just wanted to see me one last time and or say goodbye. That was so true. She wouldn't hurt me, and as I've thought about it over the years, it's really very sweet that she came to me that night. There's no way that anyone will ever convince me that this didn't happen. I was 100% awake at the time, and it was most certainly my grandma. Years later, when my first child, my daughter, was 2, she came to me again.
and that time I really believe she saved my life. I'll save that story for another time. I have been dating my boyfriend for 3 years. In September of 2020, his stepfather passed away unexpectedly due to a stroke. I was really close with him. We got on really well, and honestly, of course the death wasn't as hard for me compared to my boyfriend and his family, but it really hurt. His stepfather accepted and liked me immediately upon meeting me. We got along so well. He loves to cook, and so did I. So one day I made him and the family steak for dinner. He was super famous for his steaks. And while I was cooking, he started crying because he was so happy and proud of me. It was really hard because I always saw him as a dad too, and I was excited for him to be a part of our wedding and see our children, etc., etc. Well, when he died, my boyfriend kept saying that he would visit him in his dreams. I was happy for him, but a little sad because he hadn't come to visit me, and I began to wonder if I was even worthy of being visited. I will say I believe I have some sort of abilities, because in my boyfriend's mum's house, I often sense or feel his stepfather, especially when everyone talks about him. I've always been able to see and feel things whenever I was a kid, and so it was no surprise to me. Sometimes whenever we talk about him, he will show up and smile happily or pat someone on the shoulder, and I always relay the message to my boyfriend and he finds it comforting. Well, today is my birthday, and I had a dream that my boyfriend's family threw me a birthday dinner and his stepfather was there. He was a lot skinnier and looked polished. In the dream, I said to him, "Hey, did they bring you back?" He just smiled and shrugged and mumbled something. I then said, "They made you look really good," and he laughed. I gave him a hug and started crying, and he just rubbed my back, and he said something comforting. I said something about how I missed him. I then asked, "Are you in the house a lot? You know, when I see you and stuff." Because sometimes I don't believe I actually have abilities and think it's all in my head. But he smiled at me and said, "Yes, thank you." I woke up immediately after that because my mum came in to tell me happy birthday. Just on Saturday, my boyfriend had thrown me a surprise birthday party with my family, and I cried later that night because his stepfather wasn't there and his mum didn't come either. Last night, I literally had a dream with him and everyone else too. I'm a little sad, but so happy he visited me. So this happened to me back in 2017, when I was just about to turn 18. For a bit of context that will be important, I seem to have the same problem that a lot of men have, where I can't find something sometimes, even when it is right in front of my face. This deeply annoyed my mum, and any time that I would ask her to help me find something, and it would be in plain sight, she would pick it up and throw it at me. Not hard, just playfully, and roll her eyes really hard. Back to the day in question. My mum had just been pulled off life support after being pronounced legally brain dead. The choice was up to me, and I knew she wouldn't want a life like that. So on the evening of the day, I had told the doctors to pull the plug. My uncle, who had come from another state to help me get affairs in order, had made scalloped potatoes for dinner. After we'd finished eating, I went to the kitchen to put away the leftovers. I put the casserole dish they were made in on the stove and walked to the pantry to grab the cling wrap. I looked for a minute or two and could not find it. In my emotionally raw state, I began to lose my temper and loudly exclaimed, "Where the fuck is it?" After a moment or two, I saw a swift blur of movement above my head as the cling wrap flew off the second to top shelf and hit me
right in the face, but not very hard. It took me a moment to process what had happened. I stood there in complete shock, and then I kind of broke down in the middle of the kitchen. I tried to think of anything it could have been, trying to convince myself it couldn't have been her. But I have come up empty.